On a warm Miami night, the building feels almost peaceful. The ACK units hum in uneven rhythm, blue TV light leaks under apartment doors, and distant traffic mixes with the clink of dishes and muffled conversations. From the outside, Dexter Morgan's complex is just another aging waterfront property where neighbors argue about parking spots and broken laundry machines. But behind one perfectly normal door, a meticulous serial killer is unpacking knives instead of groceries. Let's kick things off with that contrast, because this is not a character study of Dexter, the blood spatter analyst with a code. This is a case study in collateral damage. The focus here is everyone forced to share walls with his dark passenger. The people who pass Dexter on the stairs, borrow sugar, complain about the rent increase, and never realize they are living inches away from a man who kills regularly and cleans it up before sunrise. Throughout his life, Dexter builds a routine designed to look boring. Early shifts at Miami Metro, polite nods in the hallway, the quiet neighbor who does not throw parties. From his perspective, that camouflage keeps victims and secrets contained. From the neighbor's perspective, the picture is different. Heavy plastic-wrapped bundles moved at odd hours, the sharp chemical bite of bleach in the corridor, the elevator doors closing on a man who always seems to be coming home later than everyone else. This is where the psychological horror really starts. Imagine cooking dinner while, on the other side of the drywall, a body is being prepared on plastic sheeting. Arguing with a landlord about leaks while a kill room is being dismantled and packed into garbage bags. Trying to fall asleep as water runs and fans roar, not knowing that trophies are being cataloged and every trace of a crime is being erased just a few feet away. The building remains quiet, but the silence is an illusion maintained by careful ritual and fear that has not been discovered yet. In this video, we're going to dive deep into what that illusion costs. Police cars outside at dawn, sirens reflecting off the balcony railings, crime scene techs in the parking lot, neighbors pulled into questioning or into danger simply because they live too close to Dexter's life. The long-term effects of that proximity range from constant low-level anxiety to the moral shock of realizing, years later, that every odd smell and late-night thud was a warning sign. The series quietly shows several neighbors and acquaintances drifting dangerously near the truth. A door opened at the wrong moment. A hallway encounter when Dexter returns from a kill. Small talk that brushes against his double life before he redirects the conversation. These near misses reveal how much risk and stress radiate from his front door, even if the narrative rarely centers their perspective. By the end, one question hangs over the entire building, which is worse, suspecting that something is terribly wrong and being dismissed, or never suspecting anything until the truth explodes into the open and every memory of that apartment becomes an accusation. That accusation doesn't just land on Dexter or whispering about wedding plans. Shift workers dragging themselves home at sunrise, uniforms smelling like grease, hospitals or chlorine, and people like Deb, who treat the apartment as a crash pad between chaotic shifts, dropping boots, guns, and emotional breakdowns on the floor before passing out. Everyone is busy. Everyone is exhausted. No one is eager to dig too deep into anyone else's life. Throughout his life in Miami, Dexter relies on that urban anonymity. In a city like this, arguments through the wall, the smell of someone's cooking, or footsteps at 3 a.m. are filed under city noise, not evidence. Residents see comings and goings at strange hours, trash bags hauled out late at night, the occasional glimpse of plastic sheeting through a half-open door, and the brain quietly says, "That's none of our business." The long-term effects of that reflex are devastating, but in the moment, it feels like self-protection. Dexter's choice of residence is not accidental. A modest, unremarkable apartment gives his dark passenger perfect camouflage. It keeps him close to the police station, where his role in forensics helps him identify potential victims and stay ahead of investigations. At the same time, he is a short drive from the ocean, an ideal disposal site that turns late-night drives into something that can be explained as insomnia or overtime. The building's design quietly assists. Shared walls turn specific sounds into generic thumps. A communal parking lot ensures that late-night arrivals blur together. No one tracks exactly which tenant came home at 2:37 a.m. Narrow walkways and identical doors make it difficult to remember whether that heavy bundle went into Dexter's unit or the one next door. The architecture erases individual patterns. What remains is a low-level ambient unease, a heavy-duty trash bag left by the wrong door at the wrong time, a sharp bleach smell hanging in the hallway longer than cleaning day should allow, a neighbor glimpsing Dexter's calm face as he locks his door after one of his kills, and feeling a chill that cannot be explained. Each detail is individually dismissible, but together they form an accusation that no one quite articulates. From the outside, this is just another Miami building. From the inside, once the truth is discovered, every hallway, stairwell, and balcony retroactively becomes crime-adjacent space, setting the stage for the first neighbors who actually start to question what Dexter is hiding behind that sun-faded stucco door. From that vantage point, Dexter's door is just another rectangle in a long beige corridor, and the man behind it blends in just as efficiently. Neighbors do not see the Bay Harbor butcher. They see a quiet, polite blood spatter analyst from Miami Metro who smiles on cue and holds the elevator. He carries grocery bags, not garbage bags leaking red, and that simple visual cue does a lot of subconscious work. Let's kick things off with the persona Dexter builds for that hallway audience. Throughout his life, he has learned that the safest mask is not dazzling charm or dramatic charisma, but aggressive normalcy. He is friendly, but never the one to initiate long conversations. He offers a nod, a small wave, a long day at the lab, and then disappears into his apartment before anyone can ask follow-up questions. The job title of danger is out there, somewhere in Miami, and Dexter is one of the people processing it. The truth is inverted, but from across the hall, his life reads as public service, not hidden violence. That impression is reinforced through small, calculated behaviors. He holds doors, carries Deb's moving boxes, helps an elderly neighbor with groceries, and endures awkward small talk about the heat. Each of these moments is a tiny deposit into the Dexter is normal bank. No single action proves anything, yet the accumulation makes it emotionally difficult for anyone to connect this helpful neighbor to missing persons reports or late-night thuds through the wall. The show lets the audience hear the cold analysis running under those scenes. Internally, the dark passenger is cataloging exits, estimating how long a body would bleed. Externally, the face is just a little flat, a little distant. At worst, neighbors might label him introverted, shy, maybe just exhausted from dealing with victims all day. That gap between internal narration and external performance is where the horror lives. Stereotypes do the rest. Dexter does not match the cultural image of a serial killer. No wild eyes, no overt aggression, no creepy basement, laboratory. He has a sunlit apartment, a boat, and a job that explains his comfort with blood. The alarm system in the average neighbor's head never fully arms itself, because nothing on the surface fits the profile. In hindsight, that flawless normalcy becomes its own red flag, an event that changed how every past interaction is remembered. Only once the truth is discovered does the pattern crystallize, setting up the moment when neighbors and eventually closer relationships start to question whether anyone ever truly knew who was living across the hall. That delayed recognition starts with moments that, on their own, feel harmless. A door closing at 2 a.m., footsteps in the hallway, the sound of a car trunk thudding shut before dawn. In Dexter's building, this would be the start of a pattern that only makes sense once the truth is discovered. Let's kick things off with the surface-level red flags. Dexter leaving the apartment at 2 or 3 a.m., returning as the sun comes up, never looking drunk, never bringing anyone home. Heavy plastic-wrapped bundles gripped a little too tightly as he moves from the elevator to his car. Gear that looks more industrial than domestic, rolls of thick plastic, duct tape, heavy-duty bags, a cooler that never seems to have food. In a vacuum, each detail screams danger. In a Miami complex, where people work night shifts, party late, and move constantly, it all blends into background motion. The soundscape tells a similar story. Through thin walls, neighbors would hear muffled dragging noises across the floor, the high, sticky whine of duct tape being pulled and ripped, water running for long stretches in the middle of the night. Every so often, a dull, heavy impact that feels like something hitting plastic rather than wood. But that audio track is layered under televisions, arguments, air conditioners, and distant sirens. In urban life, noise is constant, and the mind edits aggressively. Psychology does the rest. Throughout his life, Dexter relies on a basic human reflex, defaulting to the least threatening edge in place. Once neighbors accept Dexter as the polite, helpful forensic expert, every odd detail bends to protect that impression, rather than challenge it. Helping carry groceries, fixing a light, remembering a name, these gestures become evidence that he cannot be dangerous. The dark passenger is edited out of the frame. Urban life finishes the job. In a city, police cars in the parking lot, raised voices, chemical smells, and late-night activity are normalized as the cost of proximity. Mind your business becomes an unwritten code, a survival tactic against fear and retaliation. Questioning every anomaly would shatter any sense of safety. But in Dexter's orbit, there is always someone who cannot quite silence that doubt. For at least one neighbor, the late-night bundles, the bleach, and the impact sounds begin to connect. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into what happens when that instinct is finally followed, and how dangerous it becomes to stand even one step closer to Dexter's hidden life. That instinct becomes even harder to ignore when the entire building keeps turning into a backdrop for law enforcement. The fantasy of a quiet Miami complex by the water collides with the reality of sirens, squad cars, and detectives who seem to know the way to Dexter's door a little too well. Let's kick things off with the visual pattern. Patrol cars stacking up at the entrance, red and blue lights washing over stucco walls, crime scene tape fluttering in the humid air just a few doors down from Dexter's unit. Deb's a cop, so at first it tracks. An argument in the hallway, a welfare check, a late-night knock as officers look for her or for Dexter's forensic expertise. But as the seasons pile up, this would be the start of something more unsettling, a building that keeps finding itself on the edge of active investigations. Throughout his life, Dexter presents this as coincidence and proximity to police work. A neighbor only sees the surface, detectives with clipboards moving past the mailboxes, crime scene techs rolling carts down the walk, radios crackling while residents stand outside in pajamas, clutching coffee or crossing their arms against the night. Each event has a plausible explanation, yet the long-term effects of that repetition are profound. The complex stops feeling like neutral ground and starts feeling like a satellite office for Miami Metro. The sensory overload matters. Flashing lights strobe through bedroom blinds at 3 a.m., turning sleep into a stop-motion slideshow of emergency colors. The low murmur of officers trading updates, the sharp bark of a commanding voice, the thud of a knock on the wrong door asking whether anyone heard shouting, a car, a struggle. For neighbors already tense about Dexter's late-night movements and the bleach that lingers in the hallway, every siren becomes an accusation that never quite reaches words. Emotionally, it creates a strange mixture of fear, annoyance, and morbid curiosity. People complain about parking blocked by cruisers, about being late to work because an officer will not let them cross the tape without giving a brief statement. At the same time, they crane their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of the latest victim's name, the latest photo on a clipboard, tape into temporary decor. And standing behind that yellow line, watching officers move in and out, no one realizes that the calm man allowed to pass under the tape, badge on his belt, and concern on his face, is the reason the tape is there at all. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into what happens when that fade finally cracks, and a neighbor begins to see Dexter not as a shield against danger, but as the danger that has been living on the other side of their wall. That shift in perception does not happen in a vacuum. Before anyone connects Dexter to the danger, the building has already absorbed an invisible cost, collateral anxiety, paid in sleepless nights and frayed nerves. Psychologists sometimes call this secondhand trauma. It appears when people are not the direct victims of violence, but are repeatedly exposed to its echoes, police tape, sirens, rumors, and the constant reminder that someone, somewhere close, is getting hurt. In Dexter's world, that means neighbors watching patrol cars stack up outside the complex, seeing gurneys roll past the courtyard, and hearing that yet another body has been discovered a few blocks away. Over time, daily life bends around that pressure. Doors that used to be left on the latch are double-checked. People avoid the stairwell after dark, choosing the elevator even for one floor because the echoing concrete feels too exposed. Hallway sounds that once faded into the background now trigger a pause, a thump in the night, a dragging noise, raised voices bleeding through thin walls. Texts go out when sirens flare in the street. Made it home? Are the kids inside? It is the long-term effects of living in a place that never fully powers down. Sleep, which should reset that fear, gets colonized by it. Neighbors are jolted awake by police knocks on the wrong door, by emergency lights strobing through blinds, by detectives' radios crackling outside the building. That chronic interruption erodes patience, focus, and mental health. Home stops being a refuge and becomes another site of hypervigilance, where the body never fully believes it is safe enough to rest. Socially, the atmosphere curdles. In courtyards and laundry rooms, whispered conversations start with the same question: what happened this time? Rumors spread faster than official reports, filling in gaps with speculation about a killer nearby, a pattern no one can quite prove. Every new incident tightens the spiral, and people begin to eye each other with a little more suspicion in the elevator, wondering which neighbor might be connected. Dexter's specific pattern makes this worse. Throughout his life in Miami, danger clusters around him, but the explanations that reach the residents are vague, incomplete, or flat out wrong. The Bay Harbor butcher is framed as a dead cop. Random homicides are chalked up to the city's background violence. The threat never has a clear face. Anxiety becomes free-floating, hanging in the humid air as an unspoken consensus. Something is wrong here. But no one can say exactly what. To cope, the building develops its own defensive rituals. Some lean on dark humor, calling it a cursed address, blaming it on just Miami as if geography alone explains the body count. Others move into denial, refusing to read crime alerts or watch orbit. Debra, Rita, and the neighbors who move through Dexter's daily life in that Miami apartment complex. Deb's friends at the precinct, Rita's fellow parents from the suburbs, the tenants who pass Dexter in the hallway with trash bags in hand. To them, he is Deb's quiet brother, the helpful forensics guy who carries groceries, fixes a light, or remembers a kid's birthday. Throughout his life, Dexter uses this soft, neighborly competence as camouflage. Cookouts and kids' parties become some of the most chilling images in hindsight. We see Dexter at Rita's backyard barbecues, flipping burgers, laughing with neighbors, standing 3 feet from people who will later watch news reports about the Bay Harbor butcher. Those smiling photos, with Dexter holding Astor or Cody near the pool, transform into crime scene exhibits in the imagination once the truth is discovered. Every balloon, every paper plate becomes a time-stamped reminder that a prolific killer blended seamlessly into HOA meetings and school events. Dexter's selective intimacy is crucial here. He almost never lets neighbors inside emotionally, yet he offers just enough warmth to keep suspicion low. A quick joke in the hallway, a ride from a school event, an offer to watch a place while someone is out of town. The distance is calculated. He never overshares, but he never appears cold. This measured friendliness is another extension of Harry's code. Never draw attention, never seem like a threat. Parasocial trust reinforces that illusion. Many people in Dexter's orbit know him only through association: Deb's brother, Rita's boyfriend, the blood guy Masika vouches for. Trust is extended not because Dexter earns it directly, but because trusted people stand next to him and smile. In a dense complex, where names blur together, that kind of secondhand reassurance is powerful. It tells neighbors their instincts are safe to ignore. That is where the moral horror of proximity settles in. The idea that someone might have lent Dexter sugar, let their kids say hi in the hall, or fallen asleep while he dragged plastic-wrapped bodies past their door. The long-term effects of that realization, once the Bay Harbor butcher narrative connects back to Dexter, are devastating. Because this friendly social web does more than hide him, it protects him. The more casually people like Dexter, the harder it becomes for anyone to voice serious suspicion without sounding paranoid or cruel. And when the truth eventually breaks through, this same web becomes a net, catching every one of those neighbors in a storm of guilt, self-doubt, and retroactive terror that will bleed into the next phase of Dexter's life and the next set of victims who get too close. That social web of politeness becomes even more fragile when it collides with direct questions. In a cramped Miami complex, Dexter is not just a distant mystery. He is the man in the elevator, the neighbor in the parking lot, the quiet presence hauling something heavy at 3 a.m. Let's kick things off with the most basic friction point: casual curiosity. So, what do you actually do at the lab? Why are you... So the next time the question forms, it is swallowed before it reaches the surface. But some moments push past that barrier. A neighbor notices the sharp smell of bleach in the hallway on a night when there was no visible mess. Someone hears a heavy thump, then the drag of plastic across the... Another resident sees Dexter loading thick, contractor-grade trash bags into his trunk at an hour when most people are asleep. When those observations turn into questions, Dexter's response is immediate redirection, a self-deprecating joke about being a neat freak, a comment about Miami humidity rotting everything, or a sudden pivot to Deb's latest meltdown at work. Here, Dexter weaponizes social dynamics. In any shared building, the person who pushes too hard becomes the problem. Nobody wants to be the neighbor filing constant complaints or interrogating the quiet forensic guy who helps carry groceries. The long-term effects of that unspoken rule are devastating. Each resident learns, through small, awkward moments, that pressing Dexter for real answers risks embarrassment, conflict, or being labeled dramatic. So almost everyone stops 1 or 2 questions short of the truth. He also has a built-in diversion: Miami Metro and Deb. Big case on the news? That explains the late nights. Deb's visible stress, her shouting matches, her police radio bleeding through the walls, all serve as a noisy smokescreen for his own movements. if she is awake at all hours, if squad cars appear in the lot. Then Dexter's schedule looks like collateral chaos rather than a personal pattern. Again and again, neighbors hover on the edge of discovery. A follow-up about those trash bags, a request to actually see the lab reports he jokes about, a complaint about recurring bleach smells, any of these could expose a fatal inconsistency in his story. But a ringing phone, a crying child, or a passing elevator door cuts the moment short. An event that changed everything for Dexter could have started in a hallway conversation that never quite happens. Until, eventually, one neighbor's curiosity does not fully back down, and their choice to keep watching Dexter becomes the next dangerous collision between ordinary life and a killer hiding in plain sight. That curiosity is dangerous because Dexter's life does not just affect the people he chooses as victims. It radiates outward. In a building like his, the blast radius is everyone who shares walls, parking spaces, or elevator rides with a man whose dark passenger keeps demanding new bodies. Let's kick things off with a working definition of that blast radius. Throughout his life, wherever Dexter settles, the area within a few dozen yards of his front door becomes statistically cursed. Patrol cars, crime scene vans, and detectives keep showing up. Neighbors are questioned, security cameras are pulled, and ordinary residents are logged in case files because they just happen to live near the Bay Harbor Butcher without knowing it. We're going to dive deep into how that plays out. In Miami, the apartment complex that looks anonymous on the outside becomes a revolving door of investigations. When Brian Moser targets Dexter's world, a resident who notices recurring bleach smells, the thump of heavy objects, or the pattern of Dexter disappearing on specific nights might begin to keep mental notes. That vigilance can draw attention from both sides. Detectives chasing a serial killer love a neighbor with a good memory. A serial killer protecting a code sees an emerging threat. This is where the possibility of becoming a target enters. Dexter does not want to kill innocent people, and Harry's code is built around that promise. But the code also demands survival. If a neighbor's curiosity moves from background noise to active suspicion, the line between neighbor and problem to be solved becomes dangerously thin. The long-term effects of living next to Dexter are measured not only in fear after the truth is discovered, but in the quiet moments when someone's life is weighed against his need to stay hidden. In the end, the moral gray area is brutal. Dexter's priority is always self-preservation in service of the code, which means neighbors are protected only as long as they stay ignorant. In a building like his, no one has to know Dexter well to be in danger. They only have to live too close to the epicenter of his double life, waiting for the next investigation to knock on their door and ask what they saw. In that kind of environment, the danger is not just physical, it's acoustic. The real horror of living next to Dexter is that the violence is translated into sound before it ever becomes a headline or a crime scene photo. The wall is thin enough to transmit impact, but thick enough to erase context. Let's kick things off with the basic reality of apartment acoustics. Through drywall and shared pipes, sound arrives stripped of clarity. Conversations dissolve into low, humming voices. Arguments flatten into rising and falling volume. What cuts through are the anomalies. A sharp crack that jolts someone awake, a heavy thud that seems too deliberate, the sudden silence after a burst of motion that hangs in the air like a question. Next to Dexter, that soundscape becomes a nightly pattern. There is the quick, unmistakable rip of duct tape, repeated in short, efficient bursts. There is plastic sheeting rustling, a dry, dragging whisper against tile that doesn't match ordinary household chores. There are heavy objects being pulled across the floor, followed by the scrape of something being repositioned again and again until it is exactly where Dexter wants it. Water runs for long, uninterrupted stretches, as if someone is power washing a secret. And underneath all of it, at irregular intervals, the rhythmic thud of something hitting a surface with controlled force. Throughout his life, Dexter has depended on the fact that the human brain hates ambiguity. When the wall muffles the truth, the mind rushes in with explanations. That dragging sound becomes a neighbor moving furniture. The repeated thuds become a late-night workout or dropped weights. The duct tape is framed as a DIY project. The muffled, strained voice could be an argument or just a TV turned up too loud. Each noise is individually explainable, and that is exactly what makes the pattern so hard to confront. This creates an unsettling middle ground. The sounds are too intense to fully ignore, but not distinct enough to justify calling the police without feeling dramatic. Certain sounds on certain nights. A familiar thud arrives, and shoulders tense before consciousness fully returns. Silence, which should be comforting, becomes ominous when it follows a sequence that feels rehearsed. Stress accumulates in the nervous system long before the mind has language for it. And then, once Dexter is finally exposed, an event that changed the narrative forever, every remembered sound snaps into focus. Those projects, those workouts, those late showers reorganize into a timeline of violence. The neighbor is forced to confront a devastating truth. For years, the dark passenger was only a few inches away, broadcasting its work through the wall, and no one truly discovered what those noises meant until it was far too late. Once those sounds are reinterpreted as violence, the next betrayal arrives through the nose. The hallway outside Dexter's door does not just sound different after a kill, it smells different. A heavy, chemical fog of bleach and industrial cleaner hangs in the air, clinging to drywall, carpet, and the back of the throat in a way that regular housekeeping never does. Throughout his life, Dexter has treated cleanup as a sacred extension of the kill. The plastic-wrapped tables, the careful drainage, the methodical scrubbing under Harry's code all depend on erasing every trace of blood. That means gallons of harsh cleaner, the acrid sting of solvents, and, occasionally, a faint metallic tang that seeps out under the door when the air conditioner kicks on. Neighbors step off the elevator, wrinkle their noses, and walk faster, registering that something is off without having language for what it really is. Visually, the anomalies are just as striking once the mind knows how to look. A half-open door reveals rolls of plastic wrap leaning against the wall. The kind used for moving or painting, but in quantities that feel more like a supply closet than a bachelor's pantry. Industrial-strength trash bags sit in a neat stack by his unit, waiting for a late-night trip to the dumpster. Sometimes there is a glimpse of a folded tarp in the corner, or a duffel that sags in a way that suggests rigid weight rather than clothes. Yet in a dense Miami complex, the social script provides easy labels. Dexter works in forensics. Neighbors know he deals with blood, crime scenes, and contamination. So the narrative becomes simple and comforting. He is a neat freak. He is bringing work home. He is extremely careful about germs. In a city where roaches, mold, and humidity are constant enemies, that level of control feels eccentric but acceptable, even admirable. Building maintenance unintentionally reinforces the denial. When a drain backs up, when a pipe runs rusty, when a mysterious stain appears in a shared laundry line, the assumption is aging infrastructure, not dismembered victims being washed down the system. A super might complain about what Dexter is pouring into the sink, but the complaint stops at environmental concern, never moral horror. This is where the smell of denial becomes almost a character in Dexter's life. People notice once, maybe twice. Someone mentions the hallway odor to a friend, or files a casual note with management. But if no body appears, if no obvious concept out of existence, That tension between alarm and comfort prepares the ground for the next realization. If the hallway is this controlled, what happens when the control finally breaks and the consequences spill past his door? That tension becomes unbearable once a neighbor starts to notice patterns that will not go away. At first, it is just a mental note. Dexter always hauling those heavy plastic wrapped bundles out to his car at night, the recurring bleach smell in the hallway, the way police cars seem to orbit his life more than anyone else's. Then, the internal monologue starts to loop. Is this nothing? Or is there a predator next door? Let's kick things off with that private replay that happens at 3 a.m. When the building is quiet, every half-heard thud, every muffled drag across the floor, every shower that runs just a little too long comes back in high definition. Throughout his life in that Miami complex, Dexter has cultivated an image of calm, helpful professionalism, the polite blood guy from forensics who offers to carry groceries, who smiles just enough, who never raises his voice. The mind tries to reconcile that surface with the anomalies, and the result is not clarity, but doubt. This is where the evidence problem crushes initiative. Most neighbors would not have a clear image of a kill room. Only impressions, plastic sheeting glimpsed through a cracked door, a late-night trip to the marina with a suspiciously rigid garbage bag, a dark stain in the trunk that Dexter brushes off as work-related. None of that survives translation into a concrete report. Try explaining bad vibes plus bleach to an officer without sounding unstable. The narrative collapses the moment it leaves the safety of internal thought. On top of that, there is fear of retaliation, even if the word serial killer never consciously forms. Accusing someone of serious wrongdoing in a shared building is an event that changed the social landscape forever. The accused neighbor might not kill, but could yell, threaten legal action, or start a quiet campaign of harassment, noise, complaints to the landlord, subtle intimidation in the elevator. The potential consequences land on the accuser's daily life long before any formal investigation would. Then comes social pressure. Other residents might roll their eyes, tell everyone to relax, point out that Dexter works with the police and has a demanding schedule. Community culture punishes the person who breaks the illusion of safety, not the one who quietly destabilizes it. The suspicious neighbor is rebranded as paranoid, dramatic, unreliable. That label seeps in, making each new observation feel like further proof of personal instability rather than external danger. Authority bias locks the door. Dexter's connection to law enforcement, his role as a forensic blood analyst trusted to interpret the aftermath of violence, gives him built-in credibility in any conflict between a random neighbor and a respected member of the crime lab. Whose version of the truth will sound more reasonable? Even a well-intentioned officer will lean toward the colleague whose work has helped close cases and deliver victims a sense of justice. So imagine the tragic version. A neighbor does call, does report the late-night plastic, the bleach, predator, and the cracks in the mask almost always happened in liminal spaces. The parking lot at 3 a.m., the apartment corridor, the stairwell landing where someone pauses with a trash bag and accidentally shares a moment with the Bay Harbor butcher without knowing it. Let's kick things off with Dexter stumbling home from a kill, clothes rumpled, eyes dialed in on survival mode. The series gives multiple versions of this image. Dexter returning with small blood flecks he missed, a cut on his hand explained away as a crime scene accident, a gym bag that is just a little too heavy for late-night laundry. From across the hall, a neighbor glancing through a peephole would not see a ritual killer. They would see a man breathing too fast, clutching that bag like it contains something fragile and forbidden. The apartment itself becomes a pressure cooker, doors left slightly ajar because Dexter is distracted by a phone call from Debra or a sudden surge of dark passenger urges. A neighbor walks past, hears the scrape of metal, the frantic rustle of plastic sheeting being yanked out of sight. For a split second, there's a clear view through the narrowing gap, plastic taped over surfaces, tools laid out with clinical precision, the kind of scene that should only exist behind police tape. Then, the door slams, and the moment is gone. We're going to dive deep into how Dexter survives these micro-crises. His recovery tactics are instant. A disarming half-smile, a clumsy stumble that explains the drop bag, a quick joke about long hours in forensics whenever someone notices the fatigue or the smell of bleach. The code teaches him to control evidence, but everyday social interaction becomes another form of cleanup. Another kill room where suspicion has to be methodically dismembered. Chance is the silent co-conspirator. A neighbor's phone rings at the exact second they might have stepped out and seen Dexter hauling a plastic-wrapped bundle to his car. A car alarm blares in the lot, pulling someone to the window just after the trunk closes instead of just before. Another resident decides not to take the trash out, postponing the moment they would have met Dexter on the stairs, face flushed, hands shaking from an event that changed someone else's life forever. In hindsight, those almost reveals become unbearable. Once the truth is discovered, every muffled thud, every late-night elevator ride, every glimpse of plastic or tools replays in high definition. The long-term effects of that realization are not just fear, but a permanent fracture in reality. Living next to Dexter is not only dangerous, it is a constant, invisible game of Russian roulette with perception itself, where a single random second, a single open door, could have shattered the illusion and exposed the killer behind the neighborly smile. That illusion finally shatters on a day that begins like any other. Then the sirens stack up, one after another, until the entire complex feels like a crime scene. Police tape goes up around the parking lot, news vans crowd the entrance, and for the first time, reporters say Dexter Morgan's full name into live microphones. Inside, neighbors freeze. The TV shows his badge photo from Miami Metro, the familiar half-smile, and then the lower third appears, forensic analyst suspected as serial killer. Words like Bay Harbor Butcher, double life, choice in slow motion. Every late-night thump through the wall, every bleach smell in the hallway. Every time the elevator doors opened on Dexter dragging a heavy plastic-wrapped bundle, suddenly recontextualizes as potential evidence of a kill. Neighbors scrub through their own mental security footage, obsessively replaying casual greetings, odd hours, and unexplained absences. Cognitive dissonance becomes the dominant emotion. The brain has to hold two images at once, the polite man who held the elevator and the meticulous killer described on TV. The vertigo comes from realizing there is no real Dexter behind either mask. Both the friendly neighbor and the Bay Harbor Butcher are the same person, driven by the same urges, guided by the same code Harry helped build. That realization forces a confrontation with the dark passenger concept in everyday life. If someone that close could be so completely hidden, what does that say about the ability to read anyone at all? Survivor's guilt follows right behind. Some remember half-formed suspicions, a late-night tarp run, a trunk that closed too fast, a scream dismissed as a TV show through thin walls. Others remember defending Dexter when police cars crowded the complex yet again. The question becomes not just how did this go unnoticed, but did silence help him kill? Even the smallest interaction feels like potential complicity. The media circus only intensifies the trauma. Cameras clog the parking lot, journalists knock on doors asking for quotes about what Dexter was really like. And private shock is turned into public spectacle. Every neighbor face is suddenly B-roll for a serial killer documentary, their confusion and grief repackaged as content while detectives still scrape evidence from Dexter's old life. The long-term effects of that exposure are corrosive. After this, trust does not fully regenerate. Every new neighbor is a question mark. Every closed door a possible crime scene. Real safety, in hindsight, never existed. There was only ignorance. So the final dilemma lingers. Was it better to have lived beside Dexter in blissful unawareness, or to have suspected the truth and been ignored, knowing now that home was never actually safe at all? Real safety was an illusion, and once that illusion shatters, it does not quietly reassemble itself. In the quiet after the sirens, the building is left with an even heavier presence than police tape, the moral fallout of realizing Dexter Morgan lived just across the hall. Let's kick things off with the most corrosive reaction of all, internalized blame. Neighbors replay every hallway interaction, every late-night thump, every whiff of bleach, asking whether a different choice could have changed anything. That decision not to ask about the heavy plastic-wrapped bundle in the elevator, that moment of thinking, it's none of our business. The trust in authority that said, if there were a real danger, the police would handle it. Throughout his life, Dexter counted on that social reflex, that reluctance to be seen as intrusive, to keep his dark passenger invisible. After the truth is discovered, Bates, building an informal survivors group out of shared disbelief and fear. The community splits along fault lines of coping mechanisms, denial, hypervigilance, obsessive research into Dexter's cases. Underneath all of this sits the philosophical horror. Evil did not arrive in a mask. It parked in spot 23B and took the trash out on Tuesdays. The serial killer was the polite forensics guy who joked with the superintendent and helped Rita carry strollers. The lesson is brutal. The more mundane the presentation, the easier it is for a code, a ritual, and a catalog of victims to hide in plain sight. From here, we're going to dive deep into what Dexter's Neighbours represent about urban life in general, blind spots, survival narratives, and the consequences of trusting that danger always looks dramatic. Next, the focus will narrow to specific neighbor experiences, real-world parallels, and how fiction like Dexter mirrors cases where late-night noises and strange smells only made sense after the arrest. And one final question lingers in that darkened hallway. Statistically, how many apartment walls in the audience's own lives have already stood inches away from someone capable of serious violence and never revealed it? That question becomes even more unsettling when the focus shifts from dramatic arrests to the quiet, repetitive soundtrack of Dexter's daily routine leaking through drywall at 2 a.m. The horror is not just the kill room. It is the calendar of nights that never quite add up. Let's kick things off with what Dexter's Neighbours would actually register. A car engine turning over in the lot well after midnight. The soft thud of his apartment door closing with practiced care. Footsteps that never rush, never stumble, just measured strides down the hallway at hours when most people are dead asleep. Then, hours later, the same pattern in reverse. The lock clicks before dawn, keys placed down without a jingle, shower running at 4:30 a.m., followed by an almost unnerving calm at breakfast time. Throughout his life, Dexter built a rhythm that suited the dark passenger, and from across the hall, that rhythm would look like a classic night shift. At first, neighbors would reach for rational explanations. Miami Metro forensics must be on a big case. Maybe there was a late crime scene, an overtime call, a backlog of blood work. On other nights, the story might shift in their minds. Maybe he cannot sleep. Maybe there is someone he is seeing after hours. Human imagination defaults to the ordinary, even when the pattern keeps repeating. Cognitive dissonance does heavy lifting here. The same neighbors who see Dexter carrying groceries, helping Rita with the kids, or exchanging a polite nod in the parking lot are not ready to connect that social surface to the reality of victims wrapped in plastic. Harry's code was designed to keep that separation intact, and the neighbors become unintentional accomplices to the illusion by constantly supplying innocent explanations. But over time, the pattern itself starts to feel uncanny. The same car backing out at 2:07 a.m., the same pause as Dexter locks the door, the same keys finally collides with undeniable evidence, and neighbors realize those sleepless nights were not just in their heads. That vague unease does not start with flashing police lights. It starts with water, walls, and the kind of sounds that only make sense in hindsight. On a kill night, Dexter's neighbors are not watching a serial killer at work. They are listening to what sounds like a restless professional unwinding after a long shift. Let's kick things off with the shower. The water comes on late, long after most apartments have gone quiet. At first, it is normal. Miami is hot, people work odd hours. But the shower does not stop. 10 minutes, 20, 40, the pipes groan, the spray never changes, and steam creeps under Dexter's door into the hallway. Throughout his life, that shower is the first acoustic curtain between his victims and anyone close enough to hear. Then come the thumps. Apartment acoustics are cruelly selective. High, sharp noises get swallowed by drywall, but bassy impacts travel. A neighbor on the floor below feels a dull vibration, a body being dragged from bathroom to plastic-covered table, translating as someone rearranging furniture. Above, another neighbor hears a slow, rhythmic creak of floorboards. The same pattern every time Dexter returns from one of those late-night work calls. Plastic has its own sound. The thin, high crackle of sheeting being unrolled. The sticky rip of duct tape pulled again and again. In a dense Miami complex, those noises slip through vents and around door frames, riding the same channels as air conditioning and plumbing. They are recognizable on some level, but without context, they become late-night cleaning, a home project, maybe even packing for a trip. The dark passenger is fully active, but the soundtrack is domestic. Neighbors perform quiet mental gymnastics to keep it that way. The shower that runs for an hour, Dexter must be exhausted, washing off another brutal crime scene. The dragging sound at 3 a.m., he is probably moving a couch or dropping a heavy toolbox. The plastic rustling and tape snapping, protective covers for painting, or wrapping something for storage. Each noise is given a benign explanation, because the alternative would be an event that changed how they see their entire life next door. Over time, the pattern itself becomes the problem. The same late arrival, the same long shower, the same creaks in the same order. A neighbor lying awake starts to notice that the redecorating never ends, that the cleaning always happens after Dexter disappears for hours with his neatly packed duffel. We're going to dive deep into those patterns later, but here they operate as a low, constant alarm that never quite reaches full volume. Until one night, the soundscape breaks. The shower stops abruptly. There is a muffled impact, sharper than usual, followed by a short, choked noise that does not fit any domestic script. No furniture moves like that. No cleaning routine. A neighbor freezes in bed, heart pounding, realizing for the first time that the wall between them and Dexter is paper thin, and whatever just happened on the other side might mean those long showers were never about getting clean at all. Passenger, invisible, and that means repetition. Those chemicals do not appear once after a big spill and disappear. They show up at 3 a.m. when someone steps into the hallway for a glass of water. They drift into the elevator when Dexter rides down to the garage carrying a gym bag that looks too heavy for towels. They hit in the early morning when a neighbor leaves for work and notices that the corridor smells like a hospital, even though the building's cleaning crew has not arrived yet. One late-night whiff can be dismissed. a pattern cannot. The long-term effects of that pattern are subtle but corrosive. Over weeks and months, every resident on that floor would build a mental map. Dexter's door equals bleach. Dexter's late returns equal a fresh chemical haze. The association settles in before the truth is ever discovered, turning his threshold into a quiet warning sign no one can interpret. Inside, the contradiction makes it worse. On the rare occasions a neighbor glimpses Dexter's apartment, it looks spotless, almost staged. Minimal clutter, everything in its place. Surfaces clean, but not in a way that explains the heavy-duty products. No overflowing trash, no visible pets, no smoking, no cooking smells that might justify aggressive scrubbing. The visual impression says low-maintenance bachelor. The chemical footprint says biohazard control. That mismatch nags at observant residents. What needs that level of sterilization in a one-bedroom? Is there mold in the walls he is hiding? Some infestation he refuses to report to the landlord? A medical condition that requires disinfecting every surface after visitors leave? The mind reaches for rational options, because the alternative, that these are the aftermath rituals of a man who kills, does not feel possible. This would be the start of a low-level paranoia that never quite resolves. Parents worry about their kids crawling on the hallway carpet. Elderly tenants wonder if long-term exposure to these fumes will damage their health. Conversations at the mailbox circle around building maintenance, air quality, unseen contamination. No one realizes that the real contamination is behavioral, not environmental, and that the most dangerous element in their daily life is the neighbor who smiles politely while carrying home another bottle of bleach. As the pattern deepens, that nagging unease prepares the ground for a far more devastating recognition. Once police tape and news cameras finally arrive, every remembered smell will be reinterpreted as a missed alarm. Once police tape finally touches the building, the role Dexter tells the world he plays suddenly matters in a very different way. At first, blood spatter analyst sounds like a shield, a guarantee that the man upstairs is on the side of order, not chaos. Let's kick things off with that. Throughout his life at the Miami complex, Dexter presents the job as technical, almost sterile. He explains patterns, trajectories, how blood tells the truth when people lie. Neighbors hear that and imagine lab coats, microscopes, a quiet professional who helps catch killers. The title itself creates distance. The blood is out there, on scenes, on victims, never in the hallway where they pass him with groceries. Then routine sets in. Early morning elevator rides cycle catches up. Neighbors watch reports about the ice truck killer, the Bay Harbor butcher, the Trinity murders. They see aerial shots of docks, suburbs, abandoned buildings, blood on tile, blood on plastic, blood in bathtubs. Then, the next morning, they share an elevator with Dexter. Calm, polite, holding the same case that was just on screen in a blurred background. The dissonance is brutal. The man who lends a hand with packages is also the man whose entire professional life orbits around the worst moments in the city. As patterns deepen, the reassuring narrative starts to fracture. Real-world neighbors of killers often remember strange smells and late-night noises only after the truth is discovered. Here, that hindsight terror creeps in early. The bleach in the hallway, the plastic-wrapped bundles at odd hours, the sound of something dragged rather than carried. Every detail is technically explainable, yet none of it feels accidental. Harry's choice to anchor Dexter in law enforcement was meant to contain the dark passenger. But the long-term effects of that decision bleed into the lives of everyone on the other side of his walls. If death follows him professionally and unsettling events cluster around him personally, how solid can the boundary between those worlds really be? In the next phase of this descent, that boundary will not just blur, it will catastrophically collapse, for anyone living close enough to hear the sirens first. That collapse looks dramatic on screen, but for Dexter's neighbors, it plays out in a loop of sirens, flashing lights, and interrupted sleep. The building stops feeling like housing and starts feeling like a permanent extension of Miami Metro's homicide unit. Let's kick things off with the most explosive moment, the cabin fire that kills Dokes. For the neighbors, this is not framed as Leela protecting Dexter's secret. It is the night their colleague from the parking lot, the intense sergeant always glaring at Dexter, dies in an inferno and is posthumously labeled the Bay Harbor Butcher. They watch squad cars clog the street, hear radios crackle through thin stucco, and see Dexter standing behind the tape as the grieving coworker who just happened to be close to the prime suspect. Throughout his life, any major spike in Dexter's killing urges seems to summon emergency vehicles. When Lila torches his apartment, neighbors wake to the smell of smoke and the sound of pounding on doors. Hallways fill with panicked residents, red-blue strobes bouncing off peeling paint. Firefighters dragging hoses past family photos. Later, they watch the same quiet forensics guy sift through the blackened remains, officially a victim of arson, unofficially the recurring center of chaos. The ice truck killer arc pulls the building even deeper into that orbit. The moment Dexter's childhood trauma is discovered, and the case connects back to him. Patrol cars and unmarked sedans start appearing more often outside his complex. Officers knock on doors, asking if anyone has seen suspicious visitors, if anyone remembers a man matching Brian Moser's description. For neighbors, the pattern is unmistakable, a major serial killer investigation, and somehow Dexter's address keeps showing up on the clipboard. Then, Rita's death turns the entire complex whenever a siren slows near the block. The long-term effects of that constant alertness are quiet but corrosive. There are practical consequences as well. Landlords field calls from prospective tenants who have Googled the address and discovered a pattern of deaths linked to residents. Insurance premiums climb after multiple high-profile incidents, and policies are quietly rewritten. Long-term tenants feel trapped, unable to sell or break leases without financial loss, yet unwilling to uproot their lives. The building acquires a reputation it cannot shake, a stigma built on events no one fully understands. This is the collateral damage of Dexter's life, an entire community living in the splash zone of his dark passenger. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into what happens when that background dread finally crystallizes into recognition. And neighbors begin to suspect that the epicenter of all this chaos has been living just across the hall. That vague dread finally solidifies the moment homicide turns the hallway into an interrogation corridor. The crime scene tape is still up down the block, but now the investigation has come home, door by door, neighbor by neighbor. Let's kick things off with the basic reality of a homicide. Detectives do not just glance at Dexter's door and move on. They sweep the entire building. Officers knock, badges flash, notebooks open. Every resident is suddenly part of the case file. They ask about late-night noises, about visitors, about arguments bleeding through thin apartment walls. They ask who leaves early, who comes back late, who carries heavy bags to the car at 3 a.m. In a densely packed Miami complex, that means Dexter's life is reconstructed through fragments of memory from people who only ever saw him in passing. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on being unremarkable, yet a homicide canvas is designed to make the unremarkable suspicious. A neighbor who once saw him hauling plastic-wrapped bundles to his trunk now has to describe it to a detective. Another remembers the constant smell of bleach in the hallway and the way Dexter's door closed just a little too quickly when anyone approached. These details, once dismissed as background noise, are suddenly potential clues about a man whose job is literally blood. This is where the power imbalance hits. Residents are not criminals, but they are treated as potential witnesses, and by extension, potential liars. Every pause is recorded, every contradiction is noted. A neighbor with a bad memory worries that a missed time, a confused date, could accidentally implicate them in a kill they never even knew happened. The questions are simple on the surface, yet loaded with consequences. When was the last time Dexter was heard coming or going? Did he ever argue with anyone? Did anyone look afraid near his door? Over time, this scrutiny corrodes the fragile trust inside the building. The hallway, once a neutral space of mailboxes and brief greetings, becomes an informal surveillance zone. People watch each other more closely, wondering who knows more than they admitted to homicide. One resident might recall seeing Dexter with a stranger in the elevator. Another remembers hearing something heavy dragged across the floor. No one is sure who told their mouth, and makes a choice. That choice does not stay in that living room. It leaks into hallways, laundry rooms, parking spaces, and mailbox corners, where Dexter's name becomes a quiet password for fear. In a building like Dexter's, the informal information network is relentless. Neighbors trade details between washing cycles, over the hum of dryers and the smell of detergent. Someone mentions the latest police presence downstairs. Someone else remembers seeing Dexter loading heavy, plastic-wrapped bundles into his trunk at 3 a.m. Out by the shared parking, a stray comment about crime in Miami turns into a whispered, well, that blood guy on the second floor is always around when something happens. The mailboxes become a bulletin board of half-remembered encounters and half-formed suspicions. Let's kick things off with how those fragments get shaped. Throughout his life, Dexter has relied on being forgettable, but in a confined complex, anonymity is impossible. Each neighbor fills in the gaps with their own biases. The elderly tenant who only sees Dexter carrying groceries for Rita or helping with Astor and Cody quietly files him under good man, tragic workaholic, a victim of a brutal job that explains the late hours and haunted eyes. The young couple who argue about true crime podcasts paint him as a potential creep, connecting the bleach smell in the hallway with the way he avoids small talk in the elevator. Others frame him as an unlucky magnet for chaos. They remember the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation, the constant sirens, Deborah's shouting, bleeding through the walls, and the endless stream of detectives at his door. In their narrative, Dexter is not the killer. He is cursed by proximity to violence, a man whose life keeps colliding with victims and crime scenes through no fault of his own. This would be the start of a building-wide story, where Dexter is both explanation and excuse for every unsettling event. Psychologically, this gossip serves a crucial function. When danger feels random, the mind rebels. Turning Dexter into a character in a shared story restores cause and effect. The tragic workaholic version makes the violence outside feel like collateral damage from a noble profession. The creep version creates a clear villain who can be watched, managed, and avoided. The unlucky magnet version allows neighbors to believe the universe is targeting one man, not the entire building. In each case, the narrative gives a sense of control over something that is fundamentally uncontrollable. But that control comes with consequences. The more elaborate and dramatic these rumors become, the safer everyone feels inside their chosen explanation, and the further they drift from the simple. Horrifying truth, Dexter really is a serial killer, operating within arm's reach. The dark passenger is not a metaphor in these hallways. It is literally moving past their doors with knives, tarps, and plastic. Harry's code was designed to keep Dexter from being discovered, but here the building creates its own code of silence through rumor. The neighbors talk constantly, yet say nothing that matters. And as the narrative hardens, it be tenants who peek through peepholes when police cruisers pull up, or when Deborah storms down the hall shouting his name. Throughout his life in that Miami complex, Dexter is surrounded by eyes that never quite connect the dots. From there, it is easy to imagine the archetypes that fill in the rest of the building. There is the retiree on the first floor, home all day, watching the parking lot like a low-budget security camera. There is the single mom down the hall, juggling kids, groceries, and exhaustion, grateful when Dexter helps carry a box upstairs. There is the night shift worker who comes home at 3 a.m., passing Dexter in the stairwell as he heads out with a duffel bag and that practiced, disarming smile. Each contact looks harmless. A casual chat about the constant police presence. A favor-moving old equipment wrapped in plastic from trunk to storage. A complaint about noise when Dexter drops a toolbox at midnight. But every touch point is a potential intersection with the dark passenger. One extra question about his job in forensics. One lingering glance at the trunk when the wind lifts the tarp and reveals a flash of clear plastic. One child pointing at a reddish stain on his shoe before Dexter calmly steps back into shadow. We're going to dive deep into those almost discoveries because they reveal the asymmetry at the core of, to him, these neighbors are background noise, obstacles to route around so the code remains intact and the kills continue. To them, he is the nice blood guy from the lab, the quiet neighbor who never throws parties. The truth is that one wrong moment of curiosity could turn any of them into collateral victims, even if their bodies never end up on a table. Imagine the retiree wandering one door too far in the storage corridor, opening the wrong unit, and discovering plastic sheeting and neatly labeled tools. Imagine the night shift worker checking a strange noise on the dock and seeing Dexter rinse something dark into the water. In a world governed by Harry's code, these are not just awkward encounters. They are crises that demand a choice, with consequences measured in survival. The terrifying question is what happens the first time a neighbor not only notices, but refuses to look away. The terrifying question is what happens the first time a neighbor not only notices, but refuses to look away. The answer is not a dramatic confrontation in the hallway. The answer is a nervous system that never quite comes back down. Hypervigilance is the quiet sequel to Dexter's violence. In simple terms, it is the brain stuck on scan, always checking for danger, never fully off. Living next to Dexter's chaos, with police lights outside the building, sirens cutting through the night, and crime scene vans parked under the same balconies, trains the body to expect impact. Over time, this would be the start of a new baseline, tension as the default setting. Let's kick things off with the daily rituals that grow out of that tension. A neighbor who once walked the hallway barefoot at midnight now times every trip to the trash chute for broad daylight. The deadbolt gets checked twice, then a third time, hand lingering, counting sirens instead of sheep, replaying every argument heard through thin walls, every raised voice from Dexter and Deborah, wondering if one of those nights ended in a kill. Chronic anxiety follows, a body that jumps at dropped keys, a mind that cannot concentrate at work because part of it is still back home, guarding the door. Relationships strain under that invisible pressure. Partners argue about moving out, about whether the building is cursed, about why one of them refuses to leave the apartment after dark. Friends stop visiting because the parking lot feels unsafe, because there are too many stories about police tape and questioning officers. Home, which should be a refuge, becomes another crime scene waiting to happen. This is the hidden cost of Dexter's double life. Even the neighbors he never targets, as victims pay with their peace of mind. Harry's code is supposed to limit collateral damage, to focus Dexter's urges on the guilty, but the emotional fallout does not respect that boundary. The long-term effects of living beside concealed violence are measured in cortisol, lost sleep, and a permanent sense that the walls are too thin and the danger is too close. And the cruelest twist comes later, when the truth is finally discovered. Every late-night noise, every bleach-soaked hallway suddenly replays in memory, turning ordinary neighbors into unwilling witnesses after the fact, and setting the stage for the moral horror of realizing what those clues really meant. And for the youngest residents in Dexter's orbit, that realization lands on top of something even more fragile, the way home was wired in their brains in the first place. From a child's eye level, Dexter's building is almost exciting. Sirens are not a warning yet, they're moving light shows that bounce off the windows and turn bedtime into an event. Uniformed officers become regular visitors, familiar silhouettes at the end of the hallway, not a signal that someone nearby might kill or be killed. Dexter himself is the quiet man down the hall, the one who holds the elevator and remembers birthdays, the adult whose job with blood sounds like a strange cartoon profession rather than an omen. Let's kick things off with that split perception. Adults register patterns as red flags. Children register them as normal. Throughout his life, Dexter relies on that gap. Late-night knocks, raised voices from Deborah's apartment, neighbors arguing about yet another police car blocking the entrance. For kids, this is just what home looks and sounds like. The building never stabilizes into a safe backdrop. It hums with low-level crisis. Parents in that hallway are forced into constant improvisation. How many emergency visits can be brushed off as someone got sick before the story collapses under its own weight? How many loud fights, breakups, and sudden disappearances can be framed as grown-up problems without admitting that the grown-ups themselves feel powerless? The adults cannot tell the full truth. But they also cannot admit that they do not understand the danger either. So they edit, they soften, they lie. This would be the start of a different kind of code, an unspoken family rule about what gets acknowledged. Children learn to stop asking why the bleach smell is stronger some weeks than others, why that one neighbor's door is sealed off with as background actors in a horror story. In art class, asked to draw home, one kid sketches the apartment building, blue and red lights washing over the front, yellow windows stacked in rows, and in one window, a tall, faceless figure, outlined in black, standing alone beside a table. No label. No explanation. Just an intuition that something in that frame was always wrong. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how that intuition plays out once the headlines hit, and the entire building has to live with being part of Dexter Morgan's crime scene. The headlines arrive first, glowing on phone screens and buzzing through group chats before the sirens even reach the block. Dexter Morgan, Miami Metro blood spatter analyst. Arrested, suspected, then confirmed as a prolific serial killer. The polite blood guy from 2B is suddenly the Bay Harbor butcher. Let's kick things off with that first collective freeze in the hallway. Neighbors pressed against door chains, watching detectives move in and out of Dexter's old apartment. The same door that once opened to a quiet man with grocery bags now becomes an evidence portal. Throughout his life, Dexter worked hard to present as unremarkable, but this would be the start of a brutal reframe, where every memory has to be re-edited in real time. The cognitive crash hits fast. Every elevator ride is replayed. The time Dexter held the door while a neighbor's kid tugged on his sleeve. The afternoon he helped carry a stroller up the stairs. The late-night thump through the wall that everyone dismissed as dropped furniture. Suddenly, the bleach smell in the corridor, the plastic-wrapped bundles at odd hours, the tarps glimpsed in his trunk, all line up with a new, horrifying logic. We're going to dive deep into that moral whiplash, because it is not just shock, It is self-interrogation. Neighbors ask, without saying it out loud, what kind of person laughs at a barbecue with a man whose dark passenger is actively hunting victims. The parent who once felt grateful when Dexter walked their child to the mailbox now feels physically sick. The same smile that once read as shy professionalism becomes a mask, and the long-term effects of that reinterpretation can fracture trust in every future relationship. Survivor's guilt seeps in. Some residents lived closer to Dexter's violence than many of his discovered victims. They shared walls with his kill room without ever knowing. There is shame in remembering how ordinary he seemed, how easy it was to accept the story about late shifts, about demanding cases, about being tired, because forensics is brutal. The guilt is not just about missing signs. It is about realizing there was a quiet, unspoken choice to believe in safety rather than question the narrative. This is where the broader theme hits with full force. Throughout his life, Dexter benefited from a comforting cultural myth that real evil is obvious, monstrous, and far away. Harry's Code was built on precision and invisibility, and the Neighbours become collateral damage of that philosophy. When the truth finally lands, it does not only expose Dexter's urges to kill, it exposes how fragile the belief in visible danger really is. The late-night thuds against plastic sheeting, the elevator doors closing on him, hauling heavy, plastic-wrapped bundles to his car. The sharp bleach smell seeping under his door after a messy experiment. At the time, neighbors chalked it up to renovations, cleaning, maybe a clumsy forensic tech with strange hours. After the truth is discovered, those same moments fuse into a mental montage that feels damning. Let's kick things off with the smell. Real-world cases show neighbors almost always remember a strange odor once a killer is exposed. With Dexter, that hallway becomes a sensory crime scene in hindsight. A neighbor remembers propping open the stairwell door because the bleach was so strong. Another recalls Dexter apologizing with a nervous laugh, blaming a spill from work, and flashing that polite, self-effacing smile. At the time, politeness overrode suspicion. Afterward, that smile reads like camouflage for the dark passenger. The same retroactive logic hits every police visit and flashing light. Patrol cars outside the building, Deborah's shouting, bleeding through the walls, detectives knocking on Dexter's door to ask about a case. Initially, it all blended into the reality of living near law enforcement and crime scene techs in Miami. Once the Bay Harbor Butcher narrative snaps into place, the brain insists those were not coincidences, but a pattern, an event that changed how the entire building understands its own past. Psychologically, this is about imposing order on chaos. The idea that a prolific killer could live feet away without anyone noticing is unbearable, so the mind rewrites the story. Clues become clear in retrospect, because that illusion of clarity protects against the terror that there might not be any reliable signs next time. It feels safer to believe the code was always visible, and the only failure was attention. But that rewrite is cruel. Neighbors torture themselves with should have known, replaying every elevator chat about Rita, every time Dexter helped carry groceries, every moment they heard something off and chose to mind their own business. The guilt lands on them, even though Dexter's entire persona was engineered to prevent recognition. Harry's Code did not just teach him how to kill, it taught him how to be invisible inside normal social scripts. Predators like Dexter exploit those scripts relentlessly. Privacy means no one questions locked doors. Politeness means no one pushes when an answer sounds slightly off. Minding your own business becomes the perfect shield for a careful killer. As the series moves forward, we're going to dive deep into what happens when that shield finally cracks, and someone refuses to accept the comforting rewrite of the past. That shield doesn't just crack for the neighbors, it shatters for the building itself. the moment Dexter's truth is finally discovered and named on the evening news. His anonymous Miami complex becomes something else entirely, a crime scene that never really closes. Let's kick things off with the immediate aftermath. Satellite trucks jam the street, cameras pointed up at a very ordinary facade. Reporters rehearse the same chilling line, "This is where Dexter Morgan, alleged serial killer, once lived." True crime tourists drift in with phone cameras raised, taking photos of a stairwell that used to be invisible. The address circ brand cannot erase the fact that, throughout his life there, a man with a dark passenger walked those corridors carrying plastic-wrapped bundles and tools at 3 a.m. This would be the start of a different kind of haunting. New tenants arrive years later, long after Dexter has vanished, but they inherit a narrative as much as a unit. Before they unpack, friends mention the case. Someone sends a link to a documentary clip showing that same balcony. Every odd noise in the pipes, every late-night knock, carries an echo of a kill that might have happened just across the hall. Even those who did not live through Dexter's era shape their expectations around his crimes, reading meaning into normal apartment life, because the address has taught them to expect horror. The building itself becomes a character with a damaged biography. It was once just another concrete box, one more stop in Dexter's carefully managed double life. After the truth breaks, it functions as a permanent monument to the consequences of Harry's code, and to the victims whose bodies never touch those walls, but whose absence saturates them. Residents walk past the former unit and lower their voices. Maintenance workers trade stories about what detectives allegedly found. Parents debate whether to raise children in a place synonymous with a serial killer. As the series continues, we're going to dive deep into how that same geographic stain follows Dexter into the suburbs, into Oregon, and finally into Iron Lake, turning every new address into a potential landmark in his personal trail of destruction. That stain doesn't just sit on a map, it seeps into people, the neighbors who live beside Dexter in Miami, in the suburbs. And eventually, in Iron Lake, walk away with something invisible but permanent, a damaged instinct for trust that follows them into every new home. Let's kick things off with the most immediate change. After a neighbor is revealed as a prolific killer, everyday social behavior quietly mutates. The next time a friendly guy in the hallway offers to help carry groceries, there is a pause. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on that pause not existing. He was the quiet blood guy from forensics, or the attentive suburban dad, and the absence of suspicion was his camouflage. Once the truth is discovered, that default setting flips. Former neighbors start Googling every new tenant, checking social media, scrolling property records, replaying late-night sounds in their heads whenever someone down the hall drags a heavy bag. This would be the start of a new, hyper-skeptical normal. Small quirks that once felt charming now become potential red flags. Odd hours, the smell of bleach, a locked garage no one is ever invited into. These details no longer disappear into the background. They become data in a private risk assessment, a silent investigation that never really ends. The long-term effects of living next to a hidden kill room are not loud, they are chronic. At the same time, a paradox forms. Surviving neighbors often crave safety and connection more than ever. After constant police presence, crime scene tape, and media vans outside their old building. Many move precisely. One man's secret violence does not only destroy his direct victims, it fractures the social fabric around him. Neighbors learn that a serial killer can hide behind TA meetings, police badges, and family photos, and that lesson travels with them into new cities and new lives. Trust, which holds communities together, becomes a calculated risk instead of a default posture. In the next section, we're going to dive deep into how that same erosion of trust plays out inside families, where Dexter's double life turns intimacy itself into dangerous territory. Trust, which holds communities together, becomes a calculated risk instead of a default posture. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the hallways outside Dexter's door, where neighbors go from background extras to uncounted victims the moment the truth is discovered. Throughout his life, Dexter liked to imagine his victims as the bodies on the table. Plastic wrapped, sedated, neatly categorized under Harry's code. But the reality is that his victimology spills past the kill room. Every neighbor who lay awake listening to muffled thuds at 3 a.m., every tenant who smelled bleach in the hallway and convinced themselves it was nothing, is living in the blast radius of his double life. Let's kick things off with the invisible math. Years of lost sleep as sirens and police radios converge on his building. Chronic anxiety from constant crime scene tape, whispered gossip, and the knowledge that danger keeps orbiting the same apartment. Broken leases when residents decide that one too many isolated incidents have happened on this block. Then come the therapy bills, the panic attacks in grocery store aisles when someone catches a glimpse of a man who looks like Dexter, the friendships that never formed, because everyone stayed just a little distant from the quiet blood guy from forensics. On screen, the violence that defines Dexter's life is dramatic and cinematic. A kill room is revealed, a knife flashes, plastic curtains billow. The audience sees a clean arc from predator to corpse. But for the people who shared walls with him, the violence is slow and quiet. It is the erosion of safety in microscopic cuts, a door triple locked, a child no longer allowed to play in the courtyard, a neighbor who starts checking the peephole 3 times before stepping into the hallway. Real-world cases teach the same lesson. After a serial killer is caught, neighbors almost always describe late-night noises, heavy bundles carried at odd hours, strange smells that were rationalized away. Dexter's apartment in a dense Miami complex makes that pattern unavoidable. There are always eyes in the parking lot, ears in the stairwell, people forced into complicity by proximity, who later replay every interaction and wonder about the consequences of each missed warning sign. This would be the start of a different kind of body count, not measured in corpses, but in trust issues, relocation costs, and nervous systems permanently on high alert. The long-term effects of living next to a hidden predator are not as visible as a bloodslide, yet they last far longer than any single kill. At first, it plays as reassurance. After all, who wouldn't feel safer with the heroic blood guy from forensics on the 3rd floor and half the Miami Metro roster dropping by? But this would be the start of a different realization. As the seasons progress, the police presence around Dexter's home stops feeling like protection and starts to look like a pattern. Dokes watching from across the lot, Debra showing up in a panic, officers pounding on doors after a body turns up nearby. The frequency escalates, and with it, a quiet dread. If law enforcement is always orbiting one unit, what does that say about the gravity at its center? The practical consequences are relentless. Hallways that should smell like old carpet and cheap takeout instead reek of bleach and fingerprint powder. Yellow tape across the stairwell. An officer asking for ID just to get to the mailbox. Residents blocked from their own driveways while cruisers box in the entrance. Engines running. Radios crackling about another victim. Home stops being a private refuge and becomes an extension of the crime lab Dexter walks through at work. We're going to dive deep into how that changes a community's psychology. Early on, neighbors can brag about living near the blood spatter expert who helps catch killers. A man Harry's code, once aimed to keep hidden in plain sight. It feels like proximity to heroism, But as raids, questioning, and late-night searches accumulate, pride erodes. The address itself starts to feel contaminated, as if the dark passenger riding with Dexter has seeped into the building's reputation. That shift is brutal. General curiosity becomes targeted suspicion. Who buzzed in the officers? Who heard the argument? Who saw Dexter carrying heavy, plastic-wrapped bundles down to his car at 3 a.m.? Each encounter with a detective at the door is a reminder that this building is one step away from becoming a headline, that any neighbor could be dragged into a statement, an interview, even a courtroom, simply because they shared a wall with the wrong man. The long-term effects of that are hard to overstate. Kids grow up associating home with flashing lights. Adults quietly wonder how many victims were processed a few floors away, and what it means that no one discovered the truth sooner. And once Dexter is finally unmasked, the police parade doesn't just confirm their fears, it retroactively rewrites every siren, every squad car, as a warning they failed to understand. And this constant, intrusive presence around Dexter's home is only one part of the collateral damage. Next, the focus shifts to what happens when that orbit tightens, and neighbors stop being bystanders and start becoming potential targets. That orbit finally tightens the day the hallway stops being neutral ground and turns into a corridor of evidence. Yellow tape stretches across the familiar walkway. Officers guard the stairwell like a checkpoint. And numbered markers dot the same floor where neighbors usually drag in groceries or sleepy children. In an instant, the building is reframed. The beige walls and cheap carpet that always felt boring now feel contaminated, because detectives are treating this space the way Dexter treats a kill room, controlled, sealed, time. This is where we're going to dive deep into social contagion. Fear spreads faster than any official memo. By the mailboxes, neighbors huddle, whispering about what the detectives discovered. One person mentions seeing Dexter come home at 3 a.m. Another remembers police at his door months earlier. Someone else swears there was a horrible smell from the dumpster that summer. Rumors escalate from maybe drugs to maybe bodies in a single afternoon. Theories compete, cartel connections, vigilante justice, a secret life that makes Harry's code look almost rational by comparison. The hallway becomes a debate about Dexter's true nature. Was he a quiet, overworked analyst, another cog in the justice system, or an apex predator hiding in plain sight? Every detail of his life is reinterpreted through the lens of the dark passenger. The light nods, the neighborly favors, the calm presence during previous crises, now read as calculated camouflage. This would be the start of a long-term reframing, where normal memories feel like complicity. Even when the officers leave, the scene does not really end. The tape comes down, but sticky residue clings to the door frames. Scuffed walls mark where equipment scraped past. A faint outline where an evidence marker once stood refuses to fade from memory. These physical traces reactivate anxiety every time someone walks the corridor. An event that changed the building for a day becomes a psychological crime scene that lasts for years. And as the neighbors try to reclaim that hallway, the next stage of collateral damage waits, when proximity to Dexter stops at surveillance and starts demanding choices, alliances, and potential victims. That demand for choices arrives the first time a knock on the door reveals a badge instead of a delivery bag. In a building already haunted by silent fears. This is an event that changed the entire emotional temperature of the hallway. 1 second, it is laundry day. The next, a detective is holding up credentials, asking about Dexter Morgan. Let's kick things off with that first contact. There is an immediate spike of adrenaline, because law enforcement at the door signals that the abstract danger in 2B has become official. The questions start politely, almost casually, but the content is invasive. Has Dexter ever brought home heavy, plastic-wrapped bundles late at night, Are there visitors at odd hours? Any loud thuds, dragging sounds, or power tools through the walls? Everyday memories of garbage bags, bleach, and elevator rides are suddenly evidence, and the neighbor is forced to replay scenes that were previously dismissed as background noise. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on that background status to hide his dark passenger. From across the hall, he was the quiet forensics guy, the one who helped carry groceries or held the elevator. Now, detectives are turning that same routine into a timeline. They ask about Dexter's moods after late shifts, whether anyone ever saw blood on his clothes, whether arguments or crying were overheard. The conversation pushes neighbors to narrate details they would rather forget: the metallic smell in the corridor, the way Dexter's eyes went flat when he thought no one was looking, the time a visitor never came back out. This officers waiting by the mailboxes. Neighbors become hyper-vigilant about what they say, do, and even acknowledge hearing. Conversations in the stairwell are edited in real time, because any casual remark about Dexter's habits could reappear later in a statement. Over time, this would be the start of a psychological shift. The building stops being a home and becomes a low-level surveillance zone, where every creak through the walls carries potential legal consequences. We're going to dive deep into how that constant scrutiny doesn't just expose Dexter, but also reshapes the neighbor's sense of safety, guilt, and responsibility, and what happens when the questions move from "what did Dexter do?" to "how could no one have discovered the truth sooner?" That shift in focus leads to the next invasion, when the investigation stops just watching Dexter and starts mining the neighbors' lives for data. Their memories, habits, and digital footprints become auxiliary evidence, turning a quiet apartment complex or suburban street into an unwilling archive of Dexter's movements. Let's kick things off with the basic mechanics of collateral questioning. Detectives do not just ask when Dexter left for work or came home. They build a grid. Who was awake at 2 a.m. when a car trunk slammed in the parking lot? Who heard footsteps in the hallway right after a scream somewhere in the distance? Who remembers seeing Dexter carry heavy plastic wrapped bundles or smelling bleach seeping under a door? Each answer is cross-referenced against cell tower pings, traffic cameras, and Dexter's own statements, creating a timeline where neighbors' routines are the scaffolding for the truth. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on predictable patterns to mask his dark passenger: early morning runs, late-night drives, last-minute work calls for blood spatter analysis. From across the hall, these look like dedication to the job. Under interrogation, they become timestamps. The insomniac who always flips on late-night TV at 1 a.m. suddenly matters because that glow through the blinds proves the exact moment Dexter's headlights swept past. The dog walker who circles the block at dawn is no longer just a background presence, the recollection of Dexter's car missing, or unexpectedly present, can place him at or away from a kill. This would be the start of a more unsettling realization for those neighbors. Their private lives were never really private. Streaming histories, phone records, security apps, and elevator key fob logs are all pulled, copied, and preserved. A casual text, "Hear that noise next door?" becomes a digital exhibit. A saved voicemail with muffled thuds in the background is replayed in a conference room full of homicide detectives. What once felt like random daily noise is reframed as the prelude to a victim's final moments. The psychological toll here is heavy. Collateral questioning does not end when the detectives leave the living room. Neighbors replay the nights in their heads, second-guessing every gap in memory. Was that argument in Dexter's apartment just another fight with Debra, or the lead-up to a kill? Was the strong bleach smell after a hurricane cleanup, or a body being erased? The more the investigation fills in the blanks, the more they wonder whether noticing one detail sooner, willing to go to extract certainty from their lives. That next phase arrives quietly, and then all at once. One day the questions are about Dexter's hallway, the bleach smell, the late-night footsteps. The next day, a neighbor sits at a table under fluorescent lights and realizes the script has flipped. The detectives are no longer asking what was seen, they're asking where that neighbor was. Let's kick things off with that pivot point. At first, the tone feels cooperative. Help us understand Dexter's life. Help us understand his routine. Then the wording hardens. Where were you that night? Who can confirm that? Why did Dexter trust you? Throughout his life, Dexter relied on the anonymity of apartment living, but proximity turns anonymous faces into a ready-made suspect pool. The closer someone lived, the more their ordinary habits begin to look like potential evidence, or potential lies. Patterns of suspicion start to form almost mechanically. The quiet tenant who keeps to themselves becomes isolated in the report. The night shift worker who comes and goes at 3 a.m. suddenly matches the timeline of multiple kills. The neighbor who once argued with Dexter in the parking lot about a blocked space is now the person with a documented conflict and, in the detectives' minds, a possible motive. General impressions are rewritten as behavioral flags. A heavy duffel bag on the stairs, a late rent check, a missed package delivery. This would be the start of a narrative where any anomaly can be retrofitted into guilt. As investigators circulate those patterns inside the building, even informally, the social fallout begins. Rumors travel faster than official memos. Someone is being looked at. Someone else is of interest. The neighbor who once hosted barbecues finds invitations drying up because their name was mentioned in connection with Dexter's victims. Parents hesitate to let children visit certain doors. Hallway conversations shrink into nods and closed blinds because no one is sure who talked to police, who might be lying, or who might secretly share Dexter's dark passenger. We're going to dive deep into the long-term effects of that informal association. Being questioned in a serial killer case becomes a residue that never quite washes off. Background checks flag the interview. Future partners Google the address and recognize it from old coverage. Casual gossip years later turns into, they lived in the same building as Dexter Morgan, which easily drifts into, they were questioned, and then, without proof, they were almost charged. The truth is less important than the shadow the case throws over every later choice. In this way, the collateral victims extend beyond those Dexter chose to kill. Neighbors become soft targets for suspicion, for doubt, for permanent reputational damage. And as the investigation tightens, some of those same neighbors will discover that being suspected is only one danger of living near Dexter. The other is what happens when his code decides that proximity itself is a threat. In that environment, the danger stops being theoretical and becomes physiological. The body starts to learn that living near Dexter means living in a constant low-level emergency, even before the on the tile can trigger a spike of panic that feels totally out of proportion, because the body only knows that loud noises in this building usually mean police, arguments, or another crisis. Over time, this would be the start of a different kind of damage. Dreams change. A resident who once slept through anything now has recurring nightmares about home invasions, about running down those same fluorescent-lit hallways, about faceless men with knives. The apartment, which should be the safest place, becomes associated with adrenaline and dread. Even the routine sound of Dexter's shower can start to feel menacing when it always seems to run after midnight, followed by the chemical sting of bleach in the corridor. To survive that, neighbors reach for coping mechanisms. Some lean into denial, telling themselves Miami is loud, accidents happen. The police just happen to be around a lot. Others use dark humor in the laundry room, trading half-joking comments about living in a crime scene, because laughing is easier than admitting the fear. Some overshare with distant friends on the phone, narrating every siren and helicopter as if naming it will make it smaller. And a few simply numb out, pouring another drink, letting the TV run until dawn, anything to drown out the sense that the walls are listening. What makes this especially cruel is that Dexter's code is supposed to protect the innocent, yet the long-term effects of his secret violence radiate outward. The direct victims die on his tables, but the neighbors absorb the echoes, the insomnia, the jumpiness, the quiet marriages strained by constant stress. Violence does not stay contained in a kill room wrapped in plastic. It seeps under doors, through vents, into nervous systems. As the series moves forward and more characters step closer to Dexter's dark passenger, that emotional fallout will only intensify, preparing the ground for the moment when proximity stops being just stressful and becomes lethal. That rising tension does not just live in adults. It drips downward, collecting in the most vulnerable part of Dexter's blast radius, the kids on the landing who grow up next to his dark passenger without ever knowing his name for it. Throughout his life, in that Miami complex, flashing red and blue lights become a recurring backdrop. Kids hear sirens before bedtime, watch uniforms climb the stairs, and press their faces to the crack in the door chain. They collect overheard fragments about murders and blood, about a body found near the marina, about the Bay Harbor butcher living somewhere in Miami. None of it has context, but it becomes the scary vocabulary of their hallway. Parents try to build a buffer. Officers are rebranded as helpers. Crime scenes are called accidents. A neighbor escorted out for questioning is just helping the police with a problem. Let's kick things off with the gap between what is said and what is felt. Adults lower their voices, turn up the TV when crime scene photos flash on the news, and tell children it is nothing to worry about. But hands tremble when deadbolts are checked. Eyes linger too long on Dexter's door when he passes with another heavy duffel bag. The message is clear, even if the words are not. The world outside the apartment is dangerous, and it is getting closer. This would be the start of behavioral change of protectors. Yet his late-night movements, the bleach smell in the stairwell, and the way police seem to orbit his life send a different signal. Harry's code was designed to protect innocence, but the collateral fear in those hallways shows that even a controlled killer creates victims who never appear on any table. The long-term effects of this proximity only fully register years later. A teenager, now an adult, watches a documentary and realizes the address being shown is the same building from childhood. Former neighbors connect headlines to old memories. The time the elevator was out because of maintenance, the night the courtyard was filled with squad cars, the friendly neighbor who always helped carry groceries. The truth lands with a delayed impact. Childhood is retroactively re-edited as living next to a prolific serial killer, and every childhood fear suddenly makes sense. As more characters in Dexter's story move from vague fear to direct knowledge, that delayed shock will be replaced by immediate confrontation, and the consequences will escalate from nightmares to bodies on the floor. That delayed impact doesn't stay abstract for long. Across the hall, denial becomes a daily habit, a quiet psychological survival strategy that lets neighbors live next to Dexter without falling apart. Let's kick things off with cognitive dissonance. Throughout his life, Dexter projects a calm, controlled image, polite, soft-spoken, always ready to help carry boxes or fix a light, that clashes violently with the scattered clues that something is wrong. Late-night thuds, the sharp smell of bleach in a Miami hallway that already reeks of humidity, heavy plastic wrapped bundles sliding past a half-open door, Believing that the friendly blood guy from forensics could kill people is terrifying, so the mind does something easier. It edits the evidence. This is where the rationalizations rush in. Dexter works with blood, so of course there are stains, tarps, and late hours. Miami is crazy, so sirens, police tape, and crime scene vans outside the building just blend into the city's background noise. The cops know him, joke with him, trust him, so if anything serious were going on, they would have arrested him already. Neighbors tell themselves that law enforcement proximity equals safety, when in reality, it is an illusion that hides the dark passenger in plain sight. We're going to dive deep into the social cost of suspicion. Accusing a neighbor, even silently, feels like treason against the fragile peace of the hallway. This would be the start of social exile, of being the paranoid one at the building barbecue or the kid's birthday party in Rita's cul-de-sac. So instead of connecting the dots between odd hours, emotional breakdowns echoing from Deborah's apartment, and Dexter's uncanny presence at crime scenes, people disconnect them. Each red flag becomes an isolated incident, never allowed to form a coherent picture. That denial also protects self-image. Admitting real suspicion would mean accepting a passive role in the lives and deaths of Dexter's victims. It would mean acknowledging that at some point there was a choice. Ask a question. That quiet psychological avoidance sets the stage for a different kind of character, the neighbor who almost breaks the silence, but pulls back at the last second. This is the person who lives one wall away from the dark passenger and comes closer than anyone else on the block to dragging Dexter's secret into the light. Let's kick things off with a composite neighbor in Dexter's Miami complex. They hear the late-night elevator doors, the thud of heavy, plastic-wrapped bundles against the hallway rail, the sharp chemical smell of bleach that lingers long after Dexter passes. Throughout his life, Dexter normalizes these patterns with polite smiles and small talk. But from across the hall, the pattern looks different. It looks like someone who is always taking trash out at 3 a.m. Always cleaning, always just a little too careful about being seen. The turning point comes with one sound. Not a party, not another police radio from Deborah's latest meltdown, but a muffled, panicked cry that cuts through the drywall and then stops too fast. Silence after impact. Silence after fear. This would be the start of an event that changed the neighbor's internal script from harmless eccentric to possible predator. In that moment, the mind flashes to every news story about hidden killers, every interview where neighbors say they ignored the signs. We're going to dive deep into that internal debate, because the show usually cuts away from this angle. The neighbor paces the living room, phone in hand, telling themselves it is probably nothing. Dexter works with blood. Maybe he dropped equipment. Maybe someone was watching a violent movie. The brain offers explanations, because calling means accusing, and accusing means consequences if it is all a mistake. But the smell of bleach in the hallway the next morning, thicker than usual, makes those explanations harder to believe. Eventually, the phone call happens. Not 911, but a non-emergency line or anonymous tip, because even here, the neighbor is hedging. The voice on the other end is calm, professional, and exhausted. Without visible victims, without direct evidence, the report is gently redirected. Maybe file a noise complaint with building management. Maybe call back if there is something more concrete. The conversation that felt like a moral crossroads turns into an administrative shrug. The anticlimax is brutal. Nothing changes. Dexter keeps moving plastic bags at night. Police still swarm the complex for unrelated cases, reinforcing the illusion that law enforcement is always nearby and in control. The neighbor's brief surge of courage dissolves into embarrassment and doubt. When Dexter is finally exposed as a serial killer, that earlier phone call becomes a haunting memory. The neighbor replays every late-night sound, every bleach run, every time they almost knocked on Rita's door or stopped Debra in the parking lot. The long-term effects of that inaction are corrosive, a lingering belief that one more question, one more insistence, might have interrupted the code and saved future victims. And as the story shifts to people who do confront Dexter directly, the question hanging over this neighbor's life will echo into the next section. What happens? But from the neighbor's side, that's the moment the quiet forensic tech and the dark passenger briefly overlap. This is where Dexter's code collides with a problem Harry never fully prepared him for. The rules are simple. When the potential witness is a criminal, the code can justify a kill. But what happens when the threat is a completely innocent bystander who has simply discovered too much? Dexter's self-preservation instincts do not care about moral innocence. The calculus shifts from, do they deserve to die, to will they expose the truth? And that is a terrifying equation to be the answer to. The series gives us versions of this ethical cliff. Neighbors, coworkers, and casual acquaintances stumble into proximity with his secrets, an unlocked drawer, a blood-slide box out of place, a garage door left open on the wrong night. Even when the person survives, the audience is forced to consider the invisible list of almost victims, people whose only crime was living too close to the Bay Harbor butcher's front door. Collateral damage also arrives indirectly. The more Dexter kills, the more predators orbit his life. Miguel Prado, Leela, Trinity, and later adversaries in Dexter, New Blood, all learn, in different ways, that Dexter cares about his cover life. That attachment becomes leverage. A neighbor can be followed, harassed, or threatened by someone hunting Dexter, not because they matter to the hunter, but because they matter to the man the hunter wants to break. Suddenly, the friendly guy in 10B is a pressure point in a war he never agreed to fight. On top of that, any neighbor is permanently exposed to institutional fallout. Police raids, crime scene vans, press outside the building. When the truth finally surfaces, the home becomes a crime scene by association. In real cases, neighbors talk about strange smells and late-night noises only after the arrest. Here, the audience watches those clues in real time and understands how close these background characters come to becoming foreground victims. The long-term effects of sharing a wall with Dexter are brutal. The risk profile is elevated forever, simply because of who lives next door. And as the story moves to the people who do cross that line and fully confront him, the question sharpens. What happens when the neighbor is no longer collateral, but the primary target of the dark passenger itself? The long-term effects of sharing a wall with Dexter are brutal, but there is one day that slices through denial more sharply than any scalpel. It is the morning the truth finally becomes public, when the quiet neighbor next door is suddenly the Bay Harbor butcher on every screen in Miami. TVs flicker on in cramped living rooms, phones buzz on countertops, and Dexter's face appears under breaking news graphics that scream words like Bay Harbor butcher identified and forensics expert secret serial killer. Throughout his life, Dexter fought to keep the dark passenger hidden behind the badge and the lab coat. In this moment, that entire facade is demolished in a single news cycle. Let's kick things off with the sensory shock. A neighbor in a faded Dolphins t-shirt fumbles the remote, flipping channels, convinced this has to be a mistake. Another freezes in the kitchen, a mug slipping from their hand and shattering as Dexter's official ID photos, glancing at the door with Dexter's apartment number just a few feet away, and answers with something half true and half terrified. Doors crack open all along the corridor, faces peeking out, the entire building pulled into an event that changed their understanding of home. Then comes the recontextualization, an almost audible click as memories realign. Every late-night thud above the ceiling, every rolling suitcase on the stairs at 3 a.m., every sharp bleach smell in the hallway, suddenly snaps into a new, horrifying pattern. The constant police presence that once felt like bad luck now looks like a perimeter around a prolific killer. Harry's code was designed to keep Dexter from getting caught, but it never accounted for what happens when dozens of neighbors realize they have been living inches from his victim's final destination. This would be the start of a second trauma, not just knowing Dexter killed, but realizing proximity made them collateral, and as the narrative shifts from shock to investigation. The question becomes unavoidable. What are the consequences when the entire building, all at once, discovers who the dark passenger has been living next to? In the hours after the truth is finally discovered, the building doesn't just go quiet, it rewinds. Every hallway greeting, every late-night sound, every police siren near Dexter's door is suddenly replayed in brutal detail. As neighbors ask the same silent question, how was this missed when it was happening right in front of them? This is where hindsight bias takes over. Once the label serial killer is attached to Dexter, the brain rushes to reorganize the past, turning neutral memories into obvious warnings. The polite man with grocery bags becomes the predator, hiding his victim's remains. The reliable blood guy from forensics becomes the dark passenger that the entire complex accidentally protected. What once felt like random coincidences now locked together into a narrative of negligence and complicity. Let's kick things off with the most common mental replay: Dexter's calm after chaos. Police cars fill the lot, neighbors gather behind tape, a body has been found blocks away, and Dexter is on the balcony, almost unnervingly composed. At the time, that calm might have read as professional detachment. After the revelation, the same image becomes chilling. Of course he was calm. He already knew exactly what that crime scene would look like. Throughout his life in that Miami complex, Dexter also showed a practical obsession with security that now scans as predatory. Conversations about installing better locks, his interest in camera angles, his questions about who had access to the garage or which entrances stayed open late, these once sounded like a cautious neighbor trying to keep everyone safe. In the replay, they feel like reconnaissance, a methodical killer mapping blind spots, timing exits, quietly asking about neighbors' schedules to learn who left early, who came home drunk, who would never notice a body being moved at 3 a.m. The self-reproach that follows sits on a spectrum. Some residents land on the small, nagging regrets: a strange smell of bleach in the hallway, dismissed as cleaning, a heavy plastic-wrapped bundle in the elevator that went unquestioned, a late-night thud written off as someone dropping furniture. Others confronting ever feel safe or trust their own judgment again. That loss of basic trust is already brutal. But in Dexter's world, the neighbors don't just lose trust in their own judgment, they lose control over their own story. The moment Dexter is exposed, the building stops being a home and becomes a backdrop. News vans clog the street, satellite dishes unfolding like metal flowers, reporters doing live hits with his front door framed over their shoulder. Camera operators pan slowly across balconies and open windows, treating the entire complex as a crime scene prop, as if every mail slot and doormat is another clue. The Bay Harbor butcher isn't just arrested. The neighborhood is captured, replayed, and archived. Suddenly, everyone who ever passed Dexter in the hallway is raw material. Throughout his life, Dexter tried to keep his dark passenger hidden in plain sight. But once the truth is discovered, the narrative flips. Reporters knock with that same line every time. Just a quick comment. A memory. A reaction. Behind that request is a quiet pressure to perform, to become the shocked friend, the one who always knew, or the quirky local with a colorful quote that will make the evening segment pop. The casting happens. The neighbor who remembers Dexter helping with groceries becomes the knave innocent, proof that a killer can blend into everyday life. The one who recalls bleach smells and late-night thuds is turned into the intuitive witness, the person who almost cracked the case. Anyone who mentions Dexter's calm eyes or empty affect risks being edited into the eye saw the darkness roll, whether that matches their real emotional experience or not. And that's just the traditional media. The long-term effects of true crime culture push this even further. Podcast hosts dissect every interview. Documentary crews arrive months or years later, asking neighbors to walk the hallway, point at Dexter's door, recreate their terror for a tracking shot. Online sleuths freeze-frame apartment numbers, search property records, scour social media for old photos from barbecues or kids' birthday parties where Dexter might appear in the background, inches away from unsuspecting victims. What began as an event that changed their private lives becomes serialized content. Trauma turns into episodes, thumbnails, and reaction videos. The neighbors' shock, guilt, and confusion are no longer just internal reactions to living next to a man who used Harry's code to justify killing. They become reference clips in endless debates about whether Dexter was a necessary monster, whether his victims deserved it, whether the consequences for those around him were worth it. That creates a brutal double bind. Staying silent can feel like erasure, as if their proximity to this darkness never mattered. But speaking means that the most disturbing memories of their lives are replayed, remixed, and consumed as entertainment by strangers who will never walk that hallway or smell that bleach. As we're going to dive deep into the broader circle of people pulled into Dexter's orbit, one question hangs over every next interview and every new documentary. Who actually gets to own this story, and who is about to be used by it all over again? The impact doesn't end. That stigma reshapes the resident list. Some neighbors move out immediately, breaking leases and accepting penalties just to get away from the echo of sirens and crime scene tape in their heads. Others stay, but rewrite their own history. In new friendships or relationships, they insist they never really knew him, framing Dexter as the quiet guy from forensics who was always at work. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on that persona, and now the survivors rely on it too, as protection. Admitting they joked with him in the elevator or borrowed sugar across the hall feels dangerously close to admitting complicity, even when the truth is they never had a real choice. But the story refuses to stay in the past. Anniversaries of the case bring fresh interviews, archival footage, and new documentaries that replay the same hallway shots. A random social media post can go viral, dragging the address back into public view, and residents wake up to find their building trending under a true crime hashtag. What seems like closure one year is shattered the next. As a podcast host discovers a new angle and knocks on doors that have already been knocked on 100 times. Each revival is an event that changed the emotional temperature of the building all over again, forcing neighbors to relive where they were when Dexter was finally discovered. In response, the community fractures. Some residents form quiet, informal support networks, trading phone numbers, checking in on each other when a new documentary drops, sharing therapists who understand what it means to live in the aftermath of a serial killer. They meet in the courtyard or lobby and talk about sleep, about panic at the sound of late-night footsteps, about how Harry's decision to channel urges through a code didn't just create victims on a table, but collateral trauma in every adjacent unit. Others go the opposite way, isolating behind double-locked doors, unable to reconcile the memory of Dexter helping with groceries with the bodies that were never found. As we're going to dive deep into the wider circle of colleagues, lovers, and family who faced the full truth of what he did, this building becomes a preview of the question that haunts all of them. How do lives continue when the address, the job, or even the family name is permanently tied to a killer, that question is the doorway into the real horror of being Dexter's neighbor. Not the blood slides, not the boat, but the realization that extreme evil can live through the same thin drywall as small talk about the weather and complaints about the parking lot. Throughout his life, Dexter worked hard to appear boringly normal. The quiet forensics guy rolling trash cans to the curb. The neighbor who holds the elevator and asks about the kids. The man who offers to help carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs. The long-term effects of that performance only become clear after the truth is discovered. Every casual hallway nod is reinterpreted as proximity to a predator. For the people in that building, there is a moral aftershock that never really ends. Some see themselves as pure victims, pulled into danger they never consented to. The constant police presence, the sirens, the taped-off parking spaces become proof that their living next to Dexter permanently rewires what safety and trust mean. Home is supposed to be the one place where danger is outside the door. Here, danger was literally embedded in the architecture. The same walls that carried Deborah's shouting matches and police radio chatter also concealed a kill room. After that, every new neighbor, every quiet tenant, becomes a potential dark passenger waiting to be revealed. We're going to dive deep into that psychological rearrangement because it does not stay contained in one building. The neighbors carry it into new apartments, new cities, new relationships. A knock at the door late at night is no longer neutral. A friendly man with odd hours is no longer just dedicated to his job. The consequences of living beside the Bay Harbor butcher echo long after Dexter disappears from their lives. And this is where the story of one apartment complex turns into a mirror for everyone else. If Dexter could thrive undetected in a densely populated Miami building surrounded by neighbors, coworkers, and family, what does that say about the suburbs where Rita lived? The quiet New York town in New Blood, or any place called home? In the next section, we're going to dive deep into those broader questions of complicity and ordinary evil, tracing how Dexter's neighbors are only the first layer of a much larger moral crime scene. If Dexter's neighbors are the first layer of the moral crime scene, then the moment his truth finally breaks the surface is the blast wave. The shock is not just that a serial killer lived in 10B, it is that he lived in 10B and everyone went on with their lives as if nothing was wrong. In the immediate aftermath, the emotional landscape is brutal. Police tape, flashing lights, reporters at the gate, the same courtyard where kids played now framed as the backdrop to a massacre of illusions. Neighbors describe nausea, shaking hands, a surreal sense that the building itself has been lying. The hallways feel contaminated. Every late-night elevator ride with Dexter replays as a jump scare in memory, even if, at the time, it felt mundane. This is where the moral hangover begins. It is not about having helped Dexter kill or shared the dark passenger. It is about the slow, dawning realization that silence, politeness, and minding one's own business created perfect cover for a prolific hunter of victims. The hangover hits after the adrenaline fades, when the interviews end and the doors close, and there is nothing left but the question, how was this not discovered sooner? Throughout his life, Dexter depended on that gap between appearance and reality. The neighbor who heard heavy plastic dragging at 3 a.m. now lies awake, replaying the sound, wondering why it was so easy to file it under Miami noise. The bleach smell in the hallway, the tarp rolled up in the trunk, the constant crime scene chatter from a forensics job that already dealt in blood. Each detail becomes a retroactive red flag, an event that changed meaning only after the truth was public. This retrospective self-interrogation is relentless. Every smile at the mailboxes, we're going to dive deep into how that damaged self-trust ripples outward into communities and institutions, turning one killer's secret life into a collective crisis of perception and responsibility. Once Dexter is exposed, the shock does not stay in the present. It detonates backward. Every neighbor who ever passed him in the hallway now has an unwanted assignment: turn memory into evidence. Neighbors stop thinking in terms of casual impressions and start thinking like detectives. That friendly nod in the parking lot becomes a timestamp. The sound of duct tape peeling at 2 a.m. becomes an audio exhibit. The brain starts laying out a mental incident board, building a timeline of Dexter's life next door, as if preparing for interrogation. Throughout his life, Dexter counted on being forgettable. After the truth is discovered, forgettable moments become the most suspicious. Let's kick things off with the simplest interaction: the time he helped carry groceries. In the moment, it read as basic courtesy. The quiet blood guy from forensics hauling paper bags up the stairs. After exposure, that same neighbor replays the scene frame by frame. The way Dexter adjusted his grip on the heavy bag, like he had practiced lifting dead weight. The calm breathing on the third flight, no strain, as if his body was conditioned for much heavier loads. An ordinary favor is refiled as Exhibit A in a personal case file. Then there's the smell in the hallway. In a dense Miami complex, odd odors come and go, and most residents shrug them off. But once the Bay Harbor butcher is linked to Dexter, that faint chemical tang outside his door, the nights when bleach burned the back of the throat, become impossible to dismiss. Neighbors remember propping open windows, joking about someone over. Now those recollections sit under a harsh new light, recoded as evidence of kill rooms being sanitized just feet away. Another neighbor cannot stop thinking about the night Dexter came home with a cut on his face. At the time, it was a quick explanation about a suspect resisting. Another day in forensics. Afterward, confirmation bias takes over. The mind hunts for patterns that fit the new narrative and discards anything that does not. That cut is no longer workplace hazard. It is a slip from a ritual that almost went wrong. Every late return, every plastic-wrapped bundle glimpsed in the trunk, every time he avoided eye contact in the elevator, all of it is pulled into the orbit of his dark passenger. This would be the start of a deeper psychological erosion. The long-term effects of this mental re-editing go far beyond Dexter himself. Relationships between neighbors fracture as people argue over what they should have noticed. Nostalgic memories of barbecues, kids' birthday parties, and lazy afternoons by the pool are poisoned by the realization that bodies were being dismembered nearby. The past no longer feels stable. It feels editable, unreliable, haunted by missed signals and fatal consequences. And once a community learns to mistrust its own memories in the shadow of one killer, the question becomes unavoidable. What happens when that same forensic gaze turns on everyone else and the entire narrative of a hidden dark passenger, secret kill rooms, and dozens of victims loads instantly in the mind? The long-term effects of that label are brutally practical. Landlords who once bragged about ocean views now field calls from people asking, "Is that the Dexter building?" before they hang up. Owners watch property values dip as buyers factor in the stigma, calculating the consequences of raising children in a place linked to a serial killer. Vacancies linger. Background checks get stricter. Longtime residents argue in hallways and HOA meetings about whether to sell at a loss or stay and hope the market and memory eventually move on. Throughout his life, Dexter made that building a nexus of sirens, police tape, and late-night activity. After his truth is discovered, every archived news shot of cruisers outside the complex becomes retroactively damning. The address looks cursed. Potential tenants don't see a home. They see themselves walking past the same stairwell where a killer carried plastic wrap bundles at 3 a.m. The same elevator doors that closed on victims who never knew they were entering the last neutral space of their life. Meanwhile, the neighbors become reluctant ambassadors of the story. At work, at bars, on dates, conversations eventually drift to where they live, and the reaction is instant. That building, the Dexter building, from that point on, they are not just an accountant, a teacher, a nurse. They are a supporting character in the Bay Harbor Butcher saga. They retell the same anecdotes about bleach smells, police presence, and that quiet guy from forensics, performing their proximity to evil for people who want chills, not new. Underneath all of this is a deeper identity shift. A building is supposed to mean home, safety, routine. After Dexter, that same structure is inseparable from a narrative of kill tables, lies, and betrayal. Parents who once pointed out the pool now point out escape routes. Children grow up with classmates whispering that they live in the murder. The walls that held birthday parties and late-night arguments now feel like evidence lockers. Every scuff and stain, a potential clue that everyone missed. And once an address is transformed into a crime scene in the cultural imagination, the question becomes, how do the people still living there navigate a space the world insists on treating as a monument to one man's darkness? At that point, the address stops being home and becomes a warning label. The neighbors are left living inside a cautionary tale, and the real damage is what happens to their ability to trust anyone ever again. Let's kick things off with the basic, unspoken social contract of city life. Most people in dense apartments or suburbs accept a shallow level of connection. Names, maybe occupations, a shared elevator ride, a polite nod in the parking lot. Underneath that distance is one core assumption. Everyone on this block is basically safe. Not perfect, not heroic, but not secretly planning to kill. Dexter's double life detonates that baseline. Throughout his life, he perfected the role of harmless neighbor, the quiet blood guy from forensics, the helpful dad at Rita's barbecues, the tenant who carried groceries up the stairs. When the truth is finally discovered, every one of those vacuum, he worked inside the very system meant to catch killers. Police cruisers parked outside his complex, crime scene vans in and out of his orbit, detectives eating takeout in the same courtyard. The neighbors watch that constant presence and, after the reveal, have to reconcile a terrifying reality. All of that access. All of that training, and the Bay Harbor Butcher was in the bullpen the entire time. Forensic protocols, background checks, professional camaraderie, none of it stopped him. Harry's code helped Dexter evade detection, but from the outside, it looks like a total systems failure. The long-term effects of that realization are behavioral. Doors get triple locked. Curtains stay closed. Hallway conversations die out. Every raised voice through the wall, every thud on the ceiling, every trash bag carried at night becomes a possible prelude to violence. Neighbors who once exchanged favors now exchange suspicious glances. Hypervigilance replaces ordinary awareness, and withdrawal feels safer than connection. And the real horror is that this defensive posture does not stay confined to Dexter's old building. It follows his neighbors into every new lease and every new relationship, setting up the question the series keeps circling without fully answering. How do people learn to live with the idea that the next Dexter might already be standing on the other side of the wall? That fear doesn't just live in one apartment, it seeps into the entire landscape until the neighborhood itself starts to feel like an accomplice. The buildings, the streets, the skyline around Dexter become less like background and more like a character that quietly helps his dark passenger stay hidden. Throughout his life in Miami, Dexter benefits from an environment designed for anonymity. A crowded coastal city, full of tourists, night shifts, and constant traffic, makes it easy for one more tired guy hauling bags at 3 a.m. to disappear into the noise. A scream is just another argument. A thud is just another party upstairs. The city's constant motion becomes a kind of camouflage for someone who needs to kill without being discovered. Let's kick things off with Dexter's apartment complex itself. It is densely populated, with thin walls, shared parking, and neighbors always within earshot, yet almost no one truly sees him. Urban noise covers the suspicious details. The hum of air conditioners masks the sound of plastic sheeting being unrolled. Traffic muffles the dragging of heavy plastic wrapped bundles. And bleach smells in the hallway can be written off as overzealous cleaning. In a culture where everyone is told to mind their own business, curiosity feels more dangerous than silence. On top of that social pressure, there are small systemic failures that keep stacking up. Broken streetlights near the marina make it easier for Dexter to load bodies into his boat without drawing attention. Ignored complaints about noise or disturbances mean that by the time officers arrive, if they come at all, the scene is calm and Dexter's life looks perfectly normal again. Overworked cops, buried in paperwork and higher priority calls, have to accept quick explanations from the friendly forensics guy who already speaks their language. This would be the start of a pattern that stretches from Dexter's bachelor life to his suburban chapter with Rita. In the suburbs, HOA meetings obsess over lawn heights and parking violations feet away from a serial killer. The horror is not just Dexter himself. The unsettling question is whether it was bad luck to live next to him, or whether the entire environment quietly cooperated with his secrecy, setting the stage for the next person who gets close enough to sense the truth and pay the price. That quiet cooperation doesn't end when Dexter is exposed. It mutates. The same building that once absorbed his secrets gets repurposed as a backdrop, an event that changed from private nightmare to public spectacle almost overnight. First come the squad cars and news vans. Then, once the immediate chaos dies down, the second wave arrives: documentary crews, podcast hosts, and true crime tourists who treat Dexter's apartment complex like a ready-made set. The courtyard becomes Brole. The stairwell becomes an establishing shot. A hallway where neighbors once whispered about late-night bleach smells is suddenly where a host in a denim jacket does a solemn walk and talk about the dark passenger next door. Throughout his life, Dexter worked to control the narrative around his kills. After he is discovered, that control gets ripped away from everyone who lived beside him. Neighbors are approached at work, at the mailbox, even at the grocery store, asked to share their story for a limited series, a prestige doc, a viral episode. At first, it can feel like a chance to reclaim the truth. But once the cameras roll, the power balance flips fast. Interviews get chopped into sound bites. Long, halting descriptions of fear and confusion are sliced into dramatic beats and cliffhangers. A neighbor's shaking voice about hearing a thud through the wall becomes the season-ending teaser. Did they hear Dexter kill one of his victims that night? Reenactments follow, with actors retracing late-night trips to the dumpster, pausing meaningfully where Dexter once loaded his car. The real people who lived this terror watch their own memories turned into trailer moments. This would be the start of an even quieter violence. The language of production flattens everyone. The woman who raised kids in that building for a decade becomes the lady from 3B. The man who worked double shifts and tried to ignore the police tape becomes the guy who heard something. Their careers, relationships, health problems, and private grief vanish behind a single anecdote about living near Dexter. In the edited version, their life begins and ends with his crimes. Meanwhile, the public fascination tilts almost entirely toward Dexter himself. Podcasts dive deep into his psychology, debating whether Harry's code made him better or worse, mapping out his urges and rituals with forensic enthusiasm. Comment sections argue about his methods, his choice of victims, his consequences. By comparison, the ongoing, mundane suffering of those who shared his walls barely registers. Panic attacks in the laundry room, chronic insomnia, the decision to move and start over in another city, these do not make compelling cold opens. So the narrative keeps circling back to the killer, not the collateral. The legend of Dexter expands with each new episode and document, while the neighbors are left watching their own trauma replayed as entertainment, waiting to see which part of their lives gets cut next and which horrifying desk job in forensics. All of it wrapped in that emotional flatness, Dexter smiling politely at barbecues, but never really registering as present when others shared joy or grief. Individually, none of this demands action. No one in that hallway is expected to play detective or decode a dark passenger from across the courtyard. The problem is the pattern. When multiple people feel a low-level unease, when the same apartment keeps attracting police cars, crime scene vans, and late-night arguments bleeding through the walls, those shared impressions become data. Neighbors around Dexter, and later around his suburban life with Rita, experienced exactly that, repeated disturbances that were always just barely explainable. This is where small, proactive steps matter. We're going to dive deep into the gap between paranoia and vigilance, because Dexter's neighbors lived right in that space, checking in on each other after another 3 a.m. shouting match, asking if someone feels safe when sirens keep circling the same address, reporting repeated noise, strange chemical smells, or visible injuries, not because a serial killer has been discovered, but because a pattern of harm might be forming. These are modest actions, grounded in community care rather than fantasy heroics. The real lesson is that the neighbors are not fools who missed an obvious killer. They are a mirror of how most people manage discomfort. An odd schedule gets rationalized as overtime. Emotional numbness becomes quiet or private. A flash of anger in the parking lot is written off as stress. Harry's code tried to make Dexter invisible to the system. Social habits of politeness made him invisible at home. This would be the start of a larger moral question about proximity and responsibility. How many red flags have to stack up before denial gives way to action, and what are the consequences when that line is never crossed? In the next section, that question shifts from anonymous neighbors in a hallway to the people who loved Dexter most and who had far fewer excuses for looking away. That hallway question leads to the blunt reality. It really, concretely, day to day sucked to live next to Dexter Morgan. Not in a metaphorical way, but in the very practical sense of lost sleep, rattled nerves, and a home that felt permanently off balance. Let's kick things off with the surface-level misery. There were the late-night comings and goings, the elevator doors closing at 3 a.m., the thud of heavy plastic-wrapped bundles, and the metallic clink of tools. Neighbors in that densely packed Miami complex lived with constant strange noises bleeding through the walls, muffled dragging sounds, showers running at impossible hours, and the sharp chemical sting of bleach in the hallway. Add in the rotating police presence, cruisers and crime scene vans blocking parking spots, officers knocking on doors with questions no one wanted to answer, and the low-grade anxiety never really turned off. Throughout his life, Dexter treated home like a staging area, not a sanctuary. That meant everyone around him lived inside a crime-adjacent ecosystem, without consent and without context. The building's residents endured fire alarms, taped-off stairwells, and that familiar, stomach-dropping sight of flashing lights outside the window. For them, this would be the start of a pattern fades. Home no longer feels like neutral ground. The walls themselves feel complicit, as if they absorbed every hidden urge, every lie, every cover story Dexter used to keep the dark passenger close and everyone else in the dark. Even moving away does not erase the knowledge that sleep, laughter, and casual conversations once unfolded just feet from a kill room. And that is where the broader horror of proximity sets in. The worst element of Dexter was not only what he did, but how close he stayed to ordinary life while doing it. Neighbors were not bystanders to some distant monster. They were unwitting extras in the background of his double life. The danger was real, but the deeper terror was what it forced them to confront, that the sense of safety in familiar spaces is fragile, contingent, and far easier to shatter than to rebuild. In the next section, that fragile safety collapses even further, as the focus shifts from neighbors at the edge of Dexter's orbit to the family members and partners at the center, for whom denial was not just possible, but catastrophic. That fragile safety does not just collapse in Dexter's world, it raises an uncomfortable mirror. Before the credits roll and the case files close, there is one last space to walk through. The hallway outside the front door, the stairwell, the street at night. Think about how daily routines actually work. Most neighbors are known only by a door number, a muffled voice through drywall, the rhythm of footsteps at 2 a.m., or the clink of keys and a deadbolt sliding home. Throughout his life, Dexter relied on that anonymity as much as on Harry's code. The dense Miami complex, the suburban cul-de-sac, the busy station parking lot, all functioned as camouflage, because almost no one was really paying attention. This is where we're going to dive deep into the balance between awareness and paranoia. The goal is not to turn every late-night noise into a suspected kill. The goal is to recognize how easy it is to live next to someone, share walls with their secrets, and never ask what the patterns actually mean. A heavy plastic-wrapped bundle carried down the stairs, a persistent bleach smell in a shared hallway, squad cars that always seem to end up in the same driveway real cases show that such details are only remembered once the truth has been discovered. So, what does a balanced response look like? It starts small, learning names instead of just apartment numbers, noticing when someone's life suddenly changes in ways that do not match the stories being told, being willing to check in when unease lingers, instead of smoothing it over with the assumption that everything is fine. This is not suspicion of everyone. It is a commitment to attention, to community, to taking the quiet alarm bell in the back of the mind seriously enough to at least look. Throughout his life, Dexter depended on the opposite response. Harry's choice to channel his urges rather than expose them was an event that changed every neighbor who would ever live 3 feet from Dexter's dark passenger. The long-term effects of that decision rippled outward, from the anonymous tenants who heard arguments through the walls,